everybody. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all out here. My name is Elizabeth Alexander, and I'm very happy to have been asked to start us off with a poem. And I thought that what I would do is take us back to January 20th, 2009, to remind us as we go about the work that we do here of that extraordinary moment of hope and beauty and change and possibility that is always within our reach. Praise song for the day. Each day we go about our business, walking past each other, catching each other's eyes or not, about to speak or speaking. All about us is noise. All about us is noise and bramble, thorn and din, each one of our ancestors on our tongues. Someone is stitching up a hem, darning a hole in a uniform, patching a tire, repairing the things in need of repair. Someone is trying to make music somewhere, with a pair of wooden spoons on an oil drum, with cello, boombox, harmonica, voice. A woman and her son wait for the bus. A farmer considers the changing sky. A teacher says, "Take out your pencils, begin." We encounter each other in words spiny or smooth, whispered or declaimed, words to consider, reconsider. We cross dirt roads and highways that mark the will of someone and then others who said, "I need to see what's on the other side. I know there's something better down the road. We need to find a place where we are safe. We walk into that which we cannot yet see. Say it plain that many have died for this day. Sing the names of the dead who brought us here, who laid the train tracks, raised the bridges, picked the cotton and the lettuce, built brick by brick the glittering edifices they would soon keep clean and work inside of. Praise song for struggle, praise song for the day. Praise song for every hand-lettered sign, the figuring it out at kitchen tables. Some live by love thy neighbor as thyself, others by first do no harm or take no more than you need. What if the mightiest word was love? Love beyond marital, filial, national. Love that casts a widening pool of light. Love with no need to preempt grievance. In today's sharp sparkle, this winter air, anything can be made, any sentence begun. On the brink, on the brim, on the cusp. Praise song for walking forward in that light. Thank you.
Everybody to the 11th annual Afternoon of Conversation at the Aspen Ideas Festival. This is the time when we transition from the first half of the festival and say farewell to our colleagues that have joined us and welcome those of you that are joining us for the second half of Aspen Ideas Festival. I want to quickly make sure that our wonderful volunteers that are in the Hotel Jerome watching this live stream and colleagues at Greenwald also feel very welcome. We've had an amazing week so far from what you all have shared with me, and I can't thank you for your support and enthusiasm, and I hope you will give us feedback about what you've experienced so that we can do more of the same. This afternoon, we are once again thrilled to have a group of high school students from all over the United States and from the African Leadership Academy. Could we please welcome the Bezos Scholars? These are remarkable kids who are going to leave the festival and go and create festivals of their own in their high schools, and some of them have landed in the White House presenting, and it's pretty exciting to have them with us. We have a very different afternoon. We're going to get going right away. You will hear some organ music, you'll hear some remarkable conversation, and you will also engage in conversation. And thank you for being here. And we'll get going right now with Walter Isaacson and Sue Desmond-Hellman. Thank you.
I'm sure you know that Sue Desmond-Hellman is the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She was also Chancellor of the University of California at San Francisco, and a great professor of oncology, cancer research, and I'll even give the name of the professor because they're great friends of Aspen, the Arthur and Tony Rock professor at UCSF. Worked everywhere with HIV/AIDS, all over the world, and it's really cool that a real scientist, as well as a real humanist like yourself, is leading the Gates Foundation. Welcome.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
You just came back from Malawi, right? What did you learn? What do you bring back from a trip like that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I want to make sure, particularly my friends from San Francisco, know that I was drawn to the work of the foundation because of its audacious goals. Ending polio, cutting childhood mortality in half. Unbelievable, right? How about add to that decrease hunger, reduce poverty, and make sure more Americans get to and through college? So what I learned when I went to Africa, and I just got back from Malawi, South Africa, and Nigeria, is that it's great to have audacious goals. It's terrific. It's all talk. And
wait, I see one of our scholars who's from Malawi. They can't
where's
stop
the scholar
smiling.
from Malawi? All right! You have a great country. You have a great country. And being in Malawi, as you know, was such a reflection for me to move quickly from goals and metrics to the reality of what it's like to work in the toughest places on earth and ask the question, what will it take? What will it take? So I suspect that most of the people in this room, like me, landed in the Aspen airport. So let me make real what it will take in the places I just left in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's say you were getting off that plane, and like I heard, the pilot says, welcome to Aspen, it's 95 degrees outside. Seemed a little hotter than I expected. Now, as you exit the plane, I'll give you an ice cube, okay? I'll give you an ice cube. That ice cube, 3 days later, you should know that a mom with 6-day-old twins will come to your clinic, and she's dependent on you, that ice cube is still frozen, to save the lives of her 6-year-old twins. Now, I want to add one more thing to that equation. The electricity is completely unreliable, mostly non-existent, and there's no running water. You better get that ice cube to those twins. So what I learned, and one of many examples, is vaccine delivery. If we're going to end polio and cut under 5 mortality in half, all of that has to work. So what I saw in Malawi, in Nigeria, is the reality of the cold chain. That sounds, cold chain, supply chain sounds very fancy, but it is keeping frozen vaccine all the way from when it hits the country's borders to when those 6-year-old twins and their mom, who carried them on her back for 10 kilometers, is ready for them to have their vaccine.
Now, you just said the audacious goal of ending polio. If I'm correct, we've only eradicated one disease in history, right? Smallpox?
That's right. One human disease in history. In 1980, smallpox was eradicated from the face of the earth. There's actually a cattle and ruminant disease called rinderpest that's only the second disease ever eradicated. You got to remember that for the Jeopardy show. But only one ever in the face of the earth. And not only one, but there is a litany of tries over time where the globe has failed to eradicate disease. So the ambition to end polio started in earnest in 1988.
Unlike other foundation presidents, you're an actual research scientist. What do you bring from that background to the world of philanthropy?
Well, I hope what I bring is the reality of moving from innovation, technology, to what will it take for human beings to benefit from that science. When I worked all day long, every day as a cancer researcher, I got to work on some great products. People have heard of Herceptin, one of the products that I'm still really proud of. We knew when I started working on it that there was something really interesting about the science. But what I'm proud of is that women with breast cancer live longer as a result of our work. I want the work that the Gates Foundation does with NGOs and governments and universities and brilliant people to save lives. And I bring getting it done and the reality that the science only matters if we save lives and change lives.
At one of the morning panels, I think it was Joe Echeverria, maybe Broderick Johnson, was talking about you can't just have programs. Programs have to be moved into policy. Otherwise, they just become one-off things. You mainly do programs in the world of philanthropy. How do you work with a government or even business to make a partnership so these become real policies?
We don't do anything alone. And we actually like to cite the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So let me give you an example. Again, on the vaccine front, Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, is a worldwide collaboration involving multiple governments, multiple NGOs, many donors. We have supported Gavi, and many others have supported Gavi. It's a policy on foreign aid that many governments have, and all credit to them. And what this has allowed is 7 million lives to be saved that would not have had vaccines for the poorest children in the world if not for a global alliance that requires partnership, collaboration, policy, and advocacy every single day to get that done.
And one of the things you mentioned, Herceptin, and that was, I think you were the president of product development at Gentech.
I was.
And you helped pioneer the field of precision medicine. Explain what that is and how that's going to transform medicine.
Well, precision medicine it means a lot of things to people. It means at its heart and soul that patients are able to get the right medicine for their disease at the right moment. And that may be a preventive medicine, it may be a therapeutic medicine. I'll tell you, these days, I met with some of the most amazing people this morning here at the Aspen Ideas Conference who talked to me about precision agriculture. I like to think about precision public health. At its essence, it is bringing all of the ability we have to bring big data, technology, and innovation to bear so that people have a more personalized, fit for purpose approach to what they need. I think actually you can think about our programs in education as personalized or precise. Every student learns differently. Every classroom is different. Every teacher has his or her own way of teaching. So that personalization, that thinking, what does that child need right now from us, from their teacher, from their community? I think the precision medicine that I've been completely obsessed by for a long time actually does scale. It is in its essence the way that we at the foundation think about all lives have equal value, and everyone deserves to have a chance no matter what their resources are.
And so the notion of a targeted therapy that you would have done as an oncologist, that translates almost like a targeted programs or targeted to precision for each problem.
Right. So I'll tell you that one of the things that is the most astounding about what's possible in science now, and many people probably saw it with Ebola, you can literally, using the best science in the world, trace back the start of this current epidemic with Ebola, know where it came from, know how it traveled, and when new Ebola cases come up, start to do the contact tracing using the best of sequencing and the most rapid throughput. So we can use those tools. They are necessary, But the other thing we learned about Ebola, they aren't sufficient.
Right. You know, you could probably date the beginning of the computer revolution to 50 years ago. It's been 50 years, probably ever since your colleague Bill Gates broke into the computer room at Lakeside High School and decided to reprogram the computer there. We seem now to be moving the next 50 years into a new revolution. That's not a computer revolution, but a life sciences revolution based on the combination of big data technology and the life sciences. Will that be as transformative as the computer revolution was, and how do you deal with that at the foundation?
Well, I think the jury's out on how much big data and computing power will help us with life sciences. I'm an optimist. I believe it will revolutionize how we think about health. How it impacts our work at the foundation is the aspirations we can have. When we think about disease eradication at the foundation, we want to use all the tools at our disposal, even when the problems affect the world's most poor. And I think that's what Bill and Melinda have done a great job of upping the ante so that everyone, no matter what their resources are, no matter what country they live in, can have the best of science and the best of private industry come against the problems that they have. So we can use sequencing, we can partner to come up with better diagnostics and better tools. A good example is tuberculosis. So tuberculosis still ails so many in the world. There's so much suffering and resistance. That's a huge problem. We have collaborated with many scientists around the world using these new computing techniques. What if you didn't need sputum on a slide with a microscope, again, often with electricity to diagnose TB? What if you had a rapid non-sputum diagnostic out in the field? Everything would change about TB. That's the kind of thing that's possible with big data, computing power, and some of the life sciences breakthroughs we see now.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has really two main thrusts. One is global health and one is education in the U.S. Those of us who have been deeply, deeply involved with education in the U.S. and really think that it's a moral, economic, political issue of our time, we sometimes worry that the Gates Foundation kind of keeps edging more towards global health and all those trips. Perhaps you, coming from the health side, will be able to tip it back the other way. Are we going to see more effort in that zero to college pursuit that the Gates Foundation has been doing?
So one of the things I think people underestimate is actually in our roots at the Gates Foundation. The foundation's been around now for 15 years. We're nearly past adolescence, so I think that's good. We started with a global libraries program, and the original ambition was that everyone, no matter where they were, should have access to the internet for learning, and the global libraries quickly led to efforts on U.S. education. So U.S. education, we're in for the long haul. It's a very serious commitment that the foundation has had and continues to have. And so what I see at the foundation is a relentless energy that every student who goes K through 12 in the U.S. should have access to an education that gets them ready for college. And even the people who have the worst odds should have the opportunity to get into college and finish college in a way that's affordable and accessible.
I know you were just talking to Valerie Jarrett, and we were talking about My Brother's Keeper and things. How does that tie in, the equal opportunity agenda that we now feel so strongly about in this nation, and your education agenda right now?
Well, they tie together beautifully. One thing to keep in mind is the perspective that even though we have incredible resources at the Gates Foundation, and we do, our resources are tiny compared to what we spend in the U.S. on education or what we spend in the globe on health. So knowing our resources are tiny, we have to be very focused. And we focus on those school systems and school districts who are having the most stress and challenges, often as a result of poverty.
And what have you learned? Because there have been a lot of changes over the years in what Gates funds.
Yeah. What we've learned is that the single most important variable in any classroom is the teacher. Mm-hmm. We've learned that the teacher matters, and we hear from teachers that they need tools. They need professional development tools. They need curriculum. They need to actually not feel isolated, particularly if they're in a small community, and they need to connect with others. So we've also learned that students need some what we call personalized learning. Many students learn in their own ways. And I think My Brother's Keeper is a wonderful ambition, in part because we've learned that if the child gets to school in kindergarten, very, very behind, it's really tough to catch up.
A few years ago, sitting in that chair was Bill Gates, and he talked about this new thing that he's having his kids do, which was Khan Academy, to keep up. And I think Ann Dorr, she's right there, was sitting in the audience and quickly emailed Sal Khan because you were the original board member there. And it ended up being a great relationship. Sal's now on our board. But do you think we don't seem to be reaching the promise of online education that we thought 10 years ago was going to be so transformative? How do we juice that up?
Well, I think there's a couple things that we've learned about online education. I think the nation has learned about online education. It is not, for the people who struggle the most in school, they're not going to go home and get on their computer and do what Bill talked to you about. That is probably
So it could
the least likely.
exacerbate the divide in opportunity.
Absolutely, and it's been clear that having access to online is not going to help many of the students we want to help the most. On the other hand, online can address isolation. Online can provide great content, and online is also in its earliest period of time. To expect that online education is perfect today without going through iterations, I think, is unwise. So we've learned that it's a learning curve, and that to test, learn, and adjust, like with so many new technologies, is going to be part of that journey. But it doesn't replace the essence of a great teacher.
What 2 or 3 things could best be done to make sure that technology decreases the divide and opportunity between rich and poor, rather than what's happening now, increasing it?
And you mean specifically in education?
Education.
Yeah, no, I think that a couple of things. One is making sure that the technology is connected to the lesson plan and the entire curriculum that the students have. The second is not all online is created equal, and to have a high bar and to stress and push that there's actual testing. And the third, I think this is the other thing I've learned in my travels. I just was in Kentucky listening to students. You know, I'm on Procter & Gamble's board. Right. We actually don't launch a diaper without checking with customers, right? So if we're going to do online education, what about the students? And hearing the voice of the students and how the students like to learn, how they interact with any curriculum delivered online or frankly in the classroom. So I think we need, in many of the aspects of what we're doing in our mission, not to forget that there's a human being. So technology, innovation, I love that. My boss loves that, as you know, and that's terrific. But there's somebody who's going to interface with that online. How are they learning? How do they like to learn? How long do they like to sit at the computer with the online education? And so I think getting that customer feedback, that student feedback, that teacher feedback, really helpful.
All right, my last question, because you just talked about the human factor. I mean, this is, nobody spread this around. This will be just between us.
Just between us.
And the tent, no tweeting. So you now deal with Warren Buffett, who's gotten much more involved. And I can see no 2 people more different than Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. And yet they play bridge online together. What's it like dealing with the 2 of them, and how different are they?
Well, you left out one very important
And Melinda.
person, Melinda. So I often laugh, and actually the Seattle Times wrote a funny story when I joined the foundation. She likes tough bosses, so hopefully I do. So my trustees are Bill, Melinda, and Warren. And it is unbelievably great to work with the 3 of them. I feel so privileged. But you ask about Warren. I'll tell you, Warren is somebody who I think is a role model on 2 fronts, and has been a huge impact not only on me, but on Bill and Melinda. So Warren made a decision that he isn't an expert on philanthropy. And he knows that Bill and Melinda are deeply immersed, doing their homework, looking at data, using metrics, all the things he would want them to do. So without putting his name on it, he donated a big proportion of his wealth and delegated to Bill and Melinda. And that's an amazing thing. That says a lot about who Warren is and how he operates. And the second thing, and this is where he's been incredibly helpful to me, even the best companies are at risk for the ABCs, as Warren talks about them. And he outlined them in his 50th anniversary letter from Berkshire: arrogance, bureaucracy, and complacency. Now, who in this room hasn't experienced at any company, university, foundation, the ABCs of bloat? And so often I talk about this at the foundation. I push myself first and my colleagues on this. Warren, for me, is a North Star on who you want to be. He said another thing to me I'll never forget. He talked about he and Charlie thinking about the Berkshire Hathaway they wanted to create. They talked about what the history books would record about them, and then they lived accordingly. And when he talked to me about the foundation, I thought, okay, Bill and Melinda wrote about 2030 and what we aspire for the next 15 years. What are people going to write about our foundation? What's the history we're creating? Now act accordingly. He's a great role model and a great inspiration.
Dr. Susan Desmond-Hellman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll follow your North Star. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
We've been talking a lot about the beauty of mathematics, which is not a normal track for the Ideas Festival. But mathematics, like Warren Buffett, can be a North Star. It can guide you to many places. Our next speaker, a friend of mine, Brian Greene, is both a professor of math and a professor of physics at Columbia University. And by combining those really inseparable disciplines, has become the greatest explainer and one of the great pioneers of theoretical physics in our time. He has written The Elegant Universe. If that's too tough for you, you can read Icarus on the Edge of Time, which is a children's book about Icarus circling a dark hole. He is a great explainer of both string theory and topology, but also relativity and all the great science of our time. So it's a great pleasure to present to you Brian Greene.
So thank you. Is this mic on? Working? Hello. Good. So thank you, Walter. It's a great pleasure and honor to be back here. And it's a special time in science and physics in particular, because on November 25th, 1915, Albert Einstein stood in a lecture hall at the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin, and he announced to the assembled group of luminary scientists that he had finally completed a 10-year-long odyssey to find a new and deeper understanding of the force of gravity. So this November of 2015, of course, marks the 100th anniversary of the momentous discovery of the general theory of relativity. And I know that so many of you are already busily preparing your own relativity celebrations, relativity parties. It's just a beautiful, beautiful thing to witness. But I also know that, look, we all lead busy lives. We have important responsibilities, and because of that, sometimes some of us allow our understanding of general relativity to get a little rusty. And so in this banner year of the subject, it seems fitting for me to spend the 20 or so minutes that I have with you today giving a quick refresher on what Einstein found in general relativity, but also updating you on a looming puzzle that is still at the forefront of vigorous research in general relativity, having to do with the nature of black holes. All right, general relativity, what is it? Well, it is Einstein's picture of how the force of gravity works. You see, you may recall from high school that we all learned, we still do, that in the late 1600s, Isaac Newton gave us a theory of gravity, right, which says that every object in the universe pulls on every other with a force that depends on two things: how big the objects are, how far apart they are in space. And using the little mathematical version of that statement, You can use Newton's ideas to make predictions for how the moon will move, how the planets will orbit. And the observations confirm the predictions, which is spectacular. But even so, Einstein realized that there was a puzzle, a problem. He realized that Newton's ideas couldn't be the full story because Newton never told the world how gravity actually works. Right? We all know that the sun keeps the Earth in orbit, but how does it do that, right? They're separated by essentially empty space. There's like no rope connecting them. There's no arm that reaches out and clutches hold of the Earth. So what's the mechanism by which gravity gets the job done? Now, Newton knew this was a problem. In his Principia, he himself wrote, he said, to the answer of that important question, the mechanism by which gravity operates, he said, I leave it to the consideration of the reader. Now, for 200 years, every reader that read on. They just kept on going, but here's where Einstein was different. He wanted to answer this question. So he devotes himself to this puzzle. 1907, he really starts to think about it. By 1912, the problem of gravity is the only thing that he is working on. And by 1915, he gives the world this new understanding of gravity, the general theory of relativity. And the answer he found is utterly beautiful, spectacular, elusive. But in some sense, it's the most direct answer that was staring everybody in the face, but nobody else could see it. I mean, if here's the sun and here's the earth, if there's empty space between them, it must somehow be that empty space itself provides the mechanism for communicating the force of gravity. But how can space do anything? Well, here's the genius of Einstein. He realized that space and time can warp and curve, and in that way influence the motion of a body that's moving through that environment. I mean, to think about it, imagine an analogy. Consider a nice flat wooden floor like we have here on the stage. If I were to take a marble and set it rolling along the flat wooden stage, you all know it'll roll in a straight trajectory. But imagine that there's a flood causing the wood to warp, to curve. If I now take that marble and I set it rolling, it won't go in a straight trajectory any longer because the warps and curves in the wooden floor will nudge and push the marble into a curved trajectory. Einstein says that's what happens with gravity. Warps and curves in space and time can nudge an object like the Earth to go in a curved trajectory, to go into orbit around the sun. Now, of course, Einstein writes down an equation for this, allowing him to make predictions for what should happen out there. And he makes a prediction that distant starlight should follow a curved trajectory on its way to the Earth as it grazes by the sun. 1919, that prediction is tested by observations of distant stars during a solar eclipse, and the observations confirm Einstein's prediction. He gets a telegram from the team of observers alerting him that the observations had confirmed his theory, and a student who was nearby at the time said to him, Professor Einstein, what would you have said if the observations had not confirmed your theory? And Einstein famously responded, I would be sorry for the dear Lord because the theory is correct. That's 1919. 2 years before that, Einstein published in 1915, but 2 years before the confirmation, 1917, a German astronomer, mathematician, Karl Schwarzschild, who was stationed on the Russian front during World War I, and he is charged with calculating artillery trajectories. He gets a hold of Einstein's manuscript, and somehow, in the chaos of war, he starts to calculate with Einstein's equations and realizes something stunning. He realizes that in Einstein's theory, if a spherical body, like a star, should be crushed to a sufficiently small size, it'll so warp the fabric of space-time that anything which gets too close will not be able to pull away. Even light itself, if it gets too close, will fall in. So the object will appear dark. What he found, of course, is the black hole solution to Einstein's equations of general relativity. Einstein didn't believe that solution, even though it came out from his own math. Observations have shown, though, that black holes are real. The math is really telling us how the world works, and the math of this discovery is compact, elegant, powerful, much as is the case with all great breakthroughs in physics. I mean, a few years ago, if you were here, 3 years ago, in fact, I gave a little discussion of the discovery of the Higgs particle. And I demonstrated to all who were here the elegant, compact nature of the mathematics with the help of 2 assistants who demonstrated that mathematics to the audience. So back by command performance, can I have my 2 helpers again right here? Alec and Sophia. So let's see what we got here. All right, so tell me, what equation do we have right here?
Einstein field equation.
Thank you very much. What do we have over here?
Schwarzschild solution.
Right, so this actually is the mathematical solution to these equations that gives rise to the black hole solution. And amazingly, I'm so pleased, we were in touch with NASA, and they have given us the first high-resolution photograph of a black hole for display here, first time ever. Let me just show you what a black hole would look like right there. Now, the idea is this edge is the event horizon, and if anything crosses over that edge, it falls right to the center where all the matter is crushed to a fantastically small size. Empty space in between, but once you cross over the horizon, no way to get out. All right, thank you too, both. All right. And you know what? If these invitations come at the same rate every 3 years, I'm going to use this footage as a kind of coming-of-age film of my kids, sort of like Boyhood, my version of it, right here. All right, so we have the black hole solution of general relativity, and that leads to the puzzle, which now people are struggling with today. And that puzzle emerges from an insight in the 1970s about black holes due to Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking realized that black holes actually are not completely black. He realized that black holes actually emit radiation, they glow. Now, he came to this conclusion because all of the work that had been done previously, everything that I showed you on these t-shirts, is based on purely Einstein's general theory of relativity, but that ignores quantum mechanics. And Stephen Hawking found that when you include quantum mechanics in the description, the nature of black holes changes. Let me explain to you how that goes. The key idea, which is true regardless of whether or not a black hole is involved, is that quantum theory rewrites our understanding of empty space. Quantum theory says that even the most empty region of empty space is not actually completely empty. Because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, fields are always undulating up and down. Particles can be created and quickly annihilate. A roiling sea of quantum activity takes place in every region of empty space. Now, we don't see this because the processes happen so quickly. If 2 particles are created, they so quickly annihilate one another that we don't even realize that the process took place. But Hawking realized that in the vicinity of a black hole, these processes can change. Hawking realized that if here we have a black hole, the black circle that we saw on Alec's shirt, the wild quantum undulations of space just outside the black hole can create a pair of particles, but now the black hole can rip those two particles apart, allowing one to fly out into space and the other being pulled in to the black hole itself. Now, the particle that flies away, it has energy, positive energy. It radiates out into space. So its partner particle has negative energy, negative mass, if you will, which means that as that partner particle falls into the black hole's mass does not go up, it goes down. The black hole is eating a particle of negative energy, so it gets smaller through this process. So now imagine you've got a black hole with all these processes happening just outside its edge, particles flying out, others falling in. What does that look like? Well, it looks like radiation is coming out as the black hole gets smaller and smaller. Now that's a kind of familiar sounding process, right? Think of a piece of coal as it's burning. As a piece of coal burns, it gives off heat and radiation as the piece of coal gets smaller and smaller. Very similar sounding process, but there's a key difference. And the key difference is where the puzzle comes from. When a piece of coal is burning, the radiation that comes out is coming from the stuff of the coal itself undergoing the process that yields the burning, yields the radiation. So the radiation itself, coming directly from the coal stuff, bears an imprint of the coal itself. But for a black hole, the process is different, right? The stuff of the black hole is crushed in the center of the black hole, far away from the edge. The burning, if you will, is happening just outside the edge. Empty space itself is undergoing the burning. And therefore, the radiation that comes out bears no imprint of the stuff that made the black hole itself, which suggests that information is lost in the process. Let me give you an analogy so you can understand that more completely. Think of not burning a piece of coal. Think of burning a couple of books. Imagine over here, I've got War and Peace. I set it on fire. Over here, I've got 50 Shades of Grey. Set it on fire. If I carefully examine the radiation coming off of either of these burning books, I can actually recreate the book itself, because the radiation coming off bears a direct imprint of the stuff that's burning. It would be hard to do, but in principle, I could reproduce the unburnt books by examining the radiation that comes off them. No information lost. Now compare that with a slightly different kind of burning. Take War and Peace. Take 50 Shades of Grey. Throw them each into different black holes. Now examine the radiation coming off of each of those black holes, and you will, according to Stephen Hawking's original calculations, be unable to reproduce the books, because it's not the books themselves that are literally burning, it's the empty space surrounding the black hole that's burning. So the information contained in the books is not imprinted in the radiation that's coming out. Information being lost. Now, if this is really true, if information is lost through the burning, or what we call the evaporation of a black hole, then we are in trouble in physics. The whole point of physics is to take how the world is and predict how it will be in the future. But if information is lost, we can't do that. In essence, if information is lost, the laws of physics as we understand them fall apart. So this is a big deal. This is a big problem. And for that reason, people have spent decades trying to resolve it. And I think it's fair to say that there is no consensus yet on how to solve this problem. My final 2 minutes, let me just tell you a handful of the solutions that have been proposed. Some people suggest that maybe somehow there's a subtle imprint of the information contained in an object that's thrown into a black hole in that radiation. Others claim that the math doesn't allow that to happen. Some have suggested that maybe, unlike a piece of coal that can burn all the way down to nothing, maybe when a black hole burns, there's a point at which there's a remnant, a nugget that can't burn any further, and locked inside of it is the information. Other areas of science, like string theory, cast doubt on that as a viable solution. Some have suggested that maybe it's not really empty space around a black hole that's burning. Maybe the event horizon of a black hole really is a surface, a something. And maybe that something is burning like the surface of a piece of coal. This is an idea that is currently under vigorous exploration. Others have suggested even more wild ideas, like maybe there is a network of wormholes, tunnels through space, going from the inside of a black hole to the outside world, in that way blurring the distinction between outside and inside because they are secretly linked together by this tunnel, this wormhole, this collection of linkages between the inside and the outside. It is imperative that we resolve this puzzle. It's the only way that we will be able to understand a melding of quantum theory and general relativity, which is the big goal in searching for what we call the unified theory. Fact is, to my mind, it's thrilling, absolutely wondrous that this puzzle is still facing us, because it's so clear that when we solve it, as we will, our understanding of space and time and matter and energy will all be catapulted to the next level. And it's equally thrilling that 100 years after Einstein first wrote down the equations of general relativity, puzzles in that theory are still lighting the way, showing us the direction forward toward what we anticipate being the grand discoveries of the next generation. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
No, but I know that we've got some.
Now you understand why science is so beautiful. Brian Greene and Tracy Day, where's Tracy, were the co-creators of Alec and Sophie. Out of the Big Bang of our Einstein conference 11 years ago, they created the World Science Festival. Everybody here, if you want to hear more, in New York in the spring, sign up for the World Science Festival. And now it's my pleasure to introduce not only somebody who's a senior advisor to the President of the United States, a great friend of the Aspen Institute, a moral compass of this administration, and my friend, Valerie Jarrett. I know. Yeah, wow. You know, when I left Washington about 2 weeks ago to come here, the last headline I read was trade bill voted down, Obama legacy in shambles, presidency on the decline. We don't get many papers here, so has anything happened since then?
A little bit of exaggeration back then, don't you think? Yes, it's been a very big couple of weeks.
You know, what's transformative is the reaction to Charleston. I know we've had the trade bill, we've had the marriage equality decision, we've had the Affordable Care Act, but let's start with Charleston, because I actually think it's a historical inflection point on race, on violence, on guns, on so many things. As a historian, why don't you walk me through what happened? How did you hear about it? How did the president hear about it? And how did he come to make that speech?
Sure. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's just a pleasure for me to be back here again, and thank you, Walter, for your creation of this extraordinary venue and for giving me this platform to have a conversation with you all. So 2 weeks ago tonight at approximately 8:37, I think exactly 8:37, I was copied on an email from Lisa Monaco in the White House to the president informing him that there had been this atrocious mass murder. And at that point, we were aware that 8 people had perished. We weren't sure about the 9th. And then in the hours that followed, of course, we all grew to learn that after participating in over an hour Bible study class, a stranger who had been welcomed into the Emmanuel AME Church took his gun out and shot after repeatedly reloading and murdered 9 people. He left one person alive, who I met when we went down for the service displayed in the photograph. And he told her, "I'm leaving you alive so that you'll tell the story about why I did this, which is to try to attempt a racial war in this country. And I want to do this despicable act to make people angry." And of course, what followed soon after that, the young man was captured and he was arraigned. And in a moment I'll never forget listening to the sounds of the people, the family members whose loved ones had just been brutally murdered in a church, offer their forgiveness. And I think that spirit of our country says a lot about who we are. And of course, I believe that if we make the most of this opportunity, of the spotlight on what was a catastrophically devastating crime, some good could follow. Because the spirit and the actions that we saw that followed that act of generosity have galvanized our country in, I think, what could be a moment. And of course, the future is yet to be written, but the president's message when he spoke down in Charleston was one of, let's be honest with one another, let's recognize our nation's history and some of the simmering anger that still exists, but realize that we have a choice, that we could do something different.
How did he decide to go to Charleston to make that speech? I mean, he was pretty exhausted, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was pretty tired, a lot going on, but I think as the days unfolded, it became clear that the nation was so focused on this issue, and at times like this, I think the nation needs to hear from its president. I think a big part of his frustration that you heard in the first time he addressed the press right after this incident, and I think it was mistaken as his willingness to think that there was nothing we could do, almost a resignation, and that wasn't it at all. It was just, he is so tired of having to speak at these tragic events, whether it's in Aurora or Newtown or Chicago or Philadelphia, where all around our nation, we lose 30 people a day to gun violence. And he thought that after Newtown, which was his single worst day as president, that there was a real galvanization of an effort to just do something sensible about gun violence. And so he was frustrated that there was so little he could do, and so he called on the American people to respond. And I think we have seen all across this country an outpouring of response.
Did he know he was going to sing? When did you find out?
So there's a little history about the president and singing. The first time he sang, those of you might remember, he came out and he sang a little Al Green, and it went over amazingly. I think people didn't know he had such a good voice. Well, I will confess to you that I was the voice backstage when he was being egged on by the electrical engineers who were doing the sound work for the show. Go on, Mr. President, sing, sing. And I said, don't sing, please, whatever you do, don't sing. And of course he sang, and it went over very well. So as we were on our way in the helicopter to Andrews the morning of the service, we were talking about the speech, and the First Lady hadn't read the speech yet, and so he said, and when I get to the second part of referring to Amazing Grace, I think I might sing. And he looked at me like, don't sing, because you saw what happened last time you said that. And so I said, And so the First Lady said, why on earth would that fit in? And so he started to explain, and he said, I don't know whether I'm going to do it, but I just wanted to warn you two that I might sing. And he said, we'll see how it feels at the time. And from the first time he started to speak, the church was clearly with him, and there was a lot of, yeah, you take your time, Mr. President, and yeah, that's right, and slow down, and I feel you, and all the things that you get in a black church. And so he knew they were with him. And so those of you who watched it, you probably saw that he paused for a minute right before he sang. So later I said to him, were you thinking about whether or not to sing? He said, oh no, I knew I was going to sing. I was just trying to figure out which key to sing in.
They joined in right away.
And he said, and I think, and he said this on the helicopter, I think if I sing, the church will sing with me. And I think it was a powerful moment that I will never forget, particularly if you listen to the words of the song.
Right. The whole notion of Amazing Grace that came out of the families forgiving, too.
Yes.
It helped us begin a conversation about symbols of hatred, such as the Confederate battle flag and other things. Is that just a symbolic thing, or are we going to be able to take that type of discussion deeper?
Well, that's the question, and that was part of the message of his remarks. I mean, the Confederate flag is a terrible, terrible symbol that is deeply offensive, not just to African Americans, but to many people who understand its history. And yet, for so many people, they thought it was benign, and its existence in communities wasn't doing any harm. And I think what was clear, and I give Governor Nikki Haley a lot of credit for standing up so quickly with a great group of bipartisan people at her side saying, we're going to take this down, not thinking that that was the ends, as though that was the only offenses that this young man had Confederate flags on his person, but simply that symbolism is important. Symbolism counts, but the question is, what do you do beyond the symbolism? And that day the president also said, you know, we have to do something about our schools so that all of our young people have an equal opportunity to succeed. We need to make sure that health care is available in our country. We need to make sure that jobs are available and that we're not discriminating against people because of biases. So the person named John gets a better chance at a job than a person named Jamal. And so I think the whole message was, what do you do going beyond symbolism? And as you and I discussed, Walter, earlier, I guess the question is on all of us. You know, do you let this moment pass in the wave of a news cycle, or do we all collectively decide that we're going to be willing to have an honest look, not just at our history, but what kind of a future we want to have? You know, what are our values? What is our mutual obligation to one another? What kind of a society do we want to be known as? The people all over the world look to the United States to lead, and we have a great opportunity here to make the people who's lost their lives that day give it some real purpose and meaning. And when we met with the families afterwards, each family had something that they wanted to do to give back to the community. One family was making T-shirts that said "Hate doesn't win," and another family wanted to start a day camp for disadvantaged children. They're all thinking about the future and what to do to honor their loved ones. If they can do it, my goodness, can't we do that too?
Wasn't there the one who survived, who's had somebody working at the prison, right?
Yeah, so the woman who the young man spoke to and said, I want you to live to tell the story, the president, First Lady, Dr. Biden, and the vice president all met with her, along with the other families of the victims, and she described what that was like. And the president's advice to her was, you know, make sure you're taking care of yourself, because he said he had met with a lot of people who've come back from war, and the survivor's guilt can be a powerful thing. And so he said, while you're tending to the loved ones who lost their loved ones, who were your parishioners, your fellow parishioners, don't ignore your own health as well. And she said, you know, Mr. President, I used to work in the prison where that young man is now housed, and my friends still work there, and they're telling me that he's just so in tears and remorseful. And she said, in your prayers, Mr. President, remember him too. Amazing grace.
Some of us feel that there was an opportunity throughout this presidency to really deal passionately, vocally, and without putting a muffled hand in front of the face on the issue of race. And the president only did it halfway. He was always holding back on that. He got 16 months. Is this going to be the passion of the final stretch?
I think you have to ask yourself, why is that all on him? Why is that his responsibility? I think that each of us should be willing to have that conversation. And I think where he has thought it would be helpful, I mean, he gave an amazing speech about race in the midst of a hotly contested primary race that was deeply personal and open. He talked about race after Trayvon Martin's death, where he said that if I had a son, he would look like that. My brother's keeper grew out of the Zimmerman verdict, where the president said we all have to do some soul searching to figure out how are we treating one another. Last summer after Ferguson, he spoke very powerfully and then created a task force to focus on forging closer relationships between police departments and the communities that they serve and protect, particularly communities of color that have experienced disparate treatment over the years. So I think he's done a fair amount of talking. The question is, what are we going to do? What are we all going to do? And let's take the burden off of him solely, and because it is a collective responsibility. This is not something that the president can say suddenly because the country elected him president, that suddenly all of our history just evaporates. It doesn't. This has to happen family by family. It has to happen at the water cooler. That young man did not create that terrible act of violence in a vacuum. He was raised, he was in a community, he was part of a society, and I think understanding our inextricable link and obligation to each other is something that America has always been good at, and it's true to our values. And so I say the challenge and the burden is not solely on him, it's on all of us. And can we make a lot of progress in these next 18 months? Yes, we can. But we saw what some ordinary citizens could do through an act of goodness and amazing grace and forgiveness. So just imagine what the rest of us could do. Imagine if everyone in this room decided to leave this Ideas Festival and go back to your community and figure out what you're going to do to create that more perfect union.
Thank you. And part of that, beyond the discussion of race, deals with what you referred to as My Brother's Keeper initiative. You do the Women and Girls initiative too. What very specific policies and how can people get involved to make sure that people of all colors, all races, all backgrounds have an opportunity in a society where equal opportunity seems to be getting less, not better?
Well, thank you for that. Walter serves on the board of the My Brother's Keeper Alliance and has been extraordinarily supportive of this effort. And the goal is this. The goal is to say, what are we going to do to make sure that our boys and young men of color grow up and have a fair shot if they're prepared to work hard? What can we do to level the playing field? And right now, by every single metric, whether it's quality early childhood education, whether they're reading by third grade, which is an indicator as to whether you'll graduate from college on time, or high school on time, whether they're finishing high school, whether they're going to college, whether they're getting expelled or suspended from school, whether they are in the juvenile justice system, which leads right to the adult penal system, by every single metric, boys and young men of color are lagging. And so the president said, what can we do to level that playing field and make sure that every child that is born with that twinkle in their eye has an opportunity to achieve their dreams? So Broderick Johnson, who I think is here, is chairing the effort in the White House, and Joe Echeverria, the former CEO of Deloitte, is chairing the My Brother's Keeper Alliance. And what we're doing, this is not a new big government program, quite the opposite. What we're looking to do is see how the government can help streamline all of the different ways that we impact the lives of boys and men of color, but that we really put a spotlight on programs that are currently working and that are changing the trajectory of these young lives. And so, what is the research that's out there that shows what we can do in early childhood education? We know every dollar we spend on early childhood education saves us $7 down the line. So what can we do to make sure everybody gets that education? We know we need to learn to read by third grade. We are expelling and suspending too many of our young children. And we know that if you get a high school graduation and go on to college, your chance for being economically independent and successful are greatly enhanced. So we're looking at all across the country what's working. We have over, I think it is 240 communities and counting, where the mayors and county officials have stepped up and are coming up with community plans that embody what they're going to do to help these young people. And everyone in this room can can do it. You can do a mentorship. You can find that program in your community that's working and help support it. You can volunteer in your local school. You can do all kinds of creative things to help support improving this trajectory. And so thank you, Walter, again for your leadership. And I know we're going to have a session. We had a session earlier today, and we're going to deal with it a little bit tomorrow. And we just encourage everybody to get together, because remember, those young boys and men are a part of our economy going forward. Right now, and this is just a kind of a telling statistic, since 1980, we have increased our prison population in the United States ninefold. Ninefold. We are 5% of the world population, yet we house 25% of the prison population. We cannot continue on that trajectory. That is, just imagine what we could do with those resources. Nearly a third of the Justice Department's budget goes to the federal penal system. What if we were pouring that money into helping with community policing? What if we were funding early childhood education? What if we were making college more affordable? There's just so much more we can do, not to mention, the New York Times had an extraordinary piece on this a few months ago about this, 1.5 million men who are just invisible. They are either dead, or they are in prison, or they are just not active, healthy participants in our society. We need to get them back, and this is a really good way to do that.
You've been talking, I think, to the Koch brothers' general counsel on the incarceration issue. I think we'll have Paul Ryan soon up on this stage talking about opportunity, how to create opportunity in our society. This seems to be something that does not need to be as polarized as it has been for the past few years. Do you think the last year gives us the opportunity to start transcending the polarization on these issues?
I absolutely do. And I will tell you, I attended a meeting a few months ago. It was a bipartisan meeting, both House and Senate, leaders who are sponsoring legislation on criminal justice reform. And we have some very unusual bedfellows in this. So it's everything from Koch Industries to Cory Booker. So you've just got a great cross-section of the country that realizes that this is just unacceptable. And it's not just an economic argument. Many of the faith leaders are concerned about what does this say about destroying the family. If you have so many, particularly men, locked up in prison, then they're not taking care of their family obligations. And what is the effect of that on children? And if your parents are in prison, the chances of you going to prison obviously is greatly increased as well. And so I think people are coming at this from a variety of different perspectives, but recognizing that we have to change this. And so I am optimistic that we could get some serious reform through Congress. Yes, I said it. I think we can get a bill passed on criminal justice reform. But again, it's going to take the American people getting engaged and saying that this is a priority, because there's only so much time, and they tend to only do like one thing at a time. But regardless of where you come down on the trade issue, it was a good example of the president's willingness to work with a wide range of people to do what he thinks is best for our country. And he believes that criminal justice reform, the time is now, and we can't afford to wait.
The tougher, almost intractable, you could see it in his face as he sighed when he talked about it, is guns. Is there any chance out of Charleston that there's going to be some change in the mindset in this country that will allow gun legislation?
Well, here's another statistic, and I think the president tweeted about this a couple of weeks ago. We have deaths from gun violence at a rate of 297 times that which is in Japan, 49 times that which is in France, and 33 times that which is in Israel. So we do not have a corner on mental illness in the United States. And so the question is, why are we having so many disproportionate number of people dying? As I said earlier, 30 a day from gun violence. And what are we going to do about it? And we really thought after Newtown, when every poll you looked at showed that the American people, 90+%, thought that we needed just some sensible background checks, because why would you want guns to fall into the hands of the wrong people? Nobody's arguing that we shouldn't have a very strong Second Amendment. But even for those who carry guns, you don't want them falling into the wrong hands. But when we were unable to get legislation through that day, it was really extraordinarily dispiriting. And we were there with the families from Newtown and to look into the eyes of people who'd lost their 6-year-old children and try to explain how Congress could be so disconnected from their concerns and those of the American people was really frustrating. So what the president said after the Charleston horrible incident was, it's really on the American people. You've got to let your voices be heard. If you think that something should be done, and there are people like Gabby Gifford and Mark Kelly who are going state by state and helping support legislation at the state level, and that's having an impact. And if you think the federal government should do something, it's not going to happen without you getting involved and saying something. And I hope everyone does.
Final question. Final question, and Senator Mark Warner was talking about this earlier. We have a whole new 21st century economy. We're still doing by 20th century rules where you're supposed to get, you're an advocate of paid leave, but you need a full-time job to have paid leave. How do things like the Affordable Care Act, first of all, how did you discover that it was being upheld? And then secondly, how does that fit in to creating a new economy where everybody has a chance?
Well, I discovered it the way most people discovered it. I was watching the SCOTUS blog, and people often say, well, doesn't the White House get a heads up? No, we get no heads up at all. So we were watching the scroll, and then fortunately the White House counsel actually went and read the case. So he did that with his team before we went and told the president that it actually was a terrific victory, again, for the American people. The fact that you no longer have to worry about losing your insurance if you want to change jobs or if you have a pre-existing condition, or women who want to have preventive care can now do it without a copay. Those of us who have young adult children, they can stay on your insurance until they're 26, and to the now 16.4 million and counting Americans who now have health insurance, many for the first time. It is now a right in our country, and that is something I think we should all be proud of. It's a terrific thing.
Valerie Jarrett, thank you for being here, and good luck. Appreciate it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, as we set the stage for our next act, I just want to tell you a little bit about what you're going to do and participate in. If I could have your attention. Following the Ferguson debacle, Gwynne Eiffel led a town hall in Ferguson with members all over the community. And it was so stunning, you can still see it on PBS, that we've been talking about offering an opportunity for you as our audience to engage in a similar type of conversation. While this will not be taped for PBS, we are going to participate in a conversation on what does it mean to be an American, what is our identity? And I'm really delighted to introduce to you Gwynne Eiffel, who I think is one of the heroes of American television.
Thank you, Kitty. I'm going to I'll pay her later. A check is in the mail. I want to start this conversation. It's a little different what we usually do here in the tent because I'm going to ask you to be engaged in it. We're going to talk among ourselves, our carefully hand-selected panel, and then I'm going to come and pick your brains for what you think about what we've just been talking about. The topic is American identity. And I want to start by asking you to think for a moment about me. Who do you think I am? When you look at me and you see me on the stage, do you see me as the lady in the anchor chair? Do you see me as a black person, as a woman? Do you see me as someone you know or have never heard of before? Either way, however you have come up with a conclusion about who I am, it is informed by who you are. Last night, a 6-black church burned in the South, another AME church. Your first thought when you heard about this, was it arson or was it an accident? A young black man is killed or a young woman is raped on a college campus. Your first thought, whose fault? A same-sex couple moves in next door to you, and your first thought is, property values up, property values down. That is affected by who you are and what you bring to it. It's kind of like taking a picture with Instagram. If I took a picture of you right now with this, you would look colorful, or you could be washed out. You might be sepia toned. You might be completely lacking in any kind of definition. But that's because I get to choose what that means. So when I ask you these questions, I want you to ponder them, but you don't have to say the answers out loud. Because in any case, the filters are what matters in this conversation we're about to have. It's all about American identity, how we see ourselves and how we see each other. So, behind me, you see an amazing and honorable panel. Elizabeth Alexander is many things. She's an artist, she was a poet. She composed praise song for the day for the inauguration, the first inauguration of President Barack Obama. She is a black woman, obviously. Next to her is James Fallows, our token white man. As he just said to me, Jim Fallows has traveled the world looking at America from the outside in for The Atlantic as a national correspondent. And he has a unique view of how we see ourselves and how others see us as well. Next to him is Ashanti Branch. Ashanti Branch has decided to save black boys one person at a time. He's from Oakland, California. He's an educator, and he's also a brother who wears his hair in dreads. He's also has a degree in civil engineering and another master's in education, something your filter may not have known unless you looked him up. Next to him is Michelle Norris, my friend Michelle Norris, who is a host and special correspondent for NPR. In addition to that, and you may have remembered this if you were in this hall last year when we did this project, Michelle founded, curated, created something called the Race Card Project, in which she asks people to think about race in 6 words, which has turned into an amazing treasure trove, if you haven't seen it online, of the way we think about ourselves and the way we talk about ourselves. Next to Michelle is Ai-jen Poo. Ai-jen Poo is director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and she's co-director of Caring Across Generations campaign. She co-founded Domestic Workers United, which helped pass New York's Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in 2010. She's also an Asian American woman and brings her own veil of experience to our conversation. You can see this is all very carefully worked out. And finally, to my left is Joe Echeverria. He's chairman and CEO of the MBK Alliance, My Brother's Keeper Alliance, which you just heard Valerie Jarrett talk about a short time ago with Walter. It's working to eliminate gaps and opportunities for men, young boys of color. He's also a recently retired chairman, CEO of Deloitte. He also is Puerto Rican from the South Bronx and brings that to his worldview. So I want to start our conversation here, and then I want to continue the conversation with you. First, by talking to my esteemed panel and asking them to answer this question, starting with you, Elizabeth. When you think of the American identity, whether it's through your veil of experience or through your expertise as an artist who sees the world in a very unique way, what do you see?
Well, that's a question. Is it on? I see an identity that is constantly changing. I think about it as an educator more than anything. I teach African American studies at Yale University, and my version of the Common Core has Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs and Gwendolyn Brooks and Lucille Clifton, voices who have tried to articulate what it means to speak sometimes from what is called the margin, but with a full voice. I think that if you look back in American literature and you think about someone like Walt Whitman, who also cast his sights across the land and thought about and wrote about what is Americanness. Well, it's many things. Do I contradict myself? Walt Whitman wrote, "Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." So he was speaking about the self, but he was speaking about the self in the larger polis. And I think that the sort of plain-spoken way that he gives us that very profound truth, which I love most seeing in Philadelphia on a beautiful, beautiful mural in West Philly, and it's gorgeous, and looking at it in that neighborhood with a picture of a young black boy with his hands thrown to the sky makes me understand one of the many ways that poetry matters every single day. I think that he doesn't tie up with a bow this idea of what we are. Multiculturalism is dynamic, but it is what we are. This country is many, many things. it is changing, but I think if we think about who we are in our racial identities in particular, which I speak to out of my scholarship, I think that to understand that people of color and our voices are at the center of Americanness from the very beginning is a way to kind of flip the script and think about who we are.
Jim?
I'm going to come to a similar destination from a different trajectory. So, my people are Scottish and English and German. They
Hold
came.
your mic a little closer.
Sorry.
Hold your mic a little closer.
Okay, I'll hold it a little closer like this. Good. I'm going to end up saying the same thing that I have come to think about the American identity as being the world identity for this reason. I've spent more than, I guess, almost 15 years. My wife Deb and I have been living outside the country. Lots of years in China and Japan and Southeast Asia and Africa and in England. And one thing that strikes me is that if we're having this discussion outside the United States, people would say, what do you mean the American identity? We can tell all of you a mile away. If all of us were walking down the street in Beijing, every one of us would be picked out as an American. And just because of the way we carry ourselves, the kinds of the culture we have. I once did a photo series on the Atlantic's website of having pictures of Asian Americans and Asian Asians taken in China and Japan and Thailand, and to 100% accuracy, people could pick out who were the Asian Americans and who were the Asians. The point is, I'm getting at, is there is a strong identity Americans have in our culture, in our shared references, in our patriotism, and all the rest. What I have come to think is that from the rest of the world's assessment of our identity, there are parts they don't like. Violence is first on that list. The role of guns, the role of all the abuses they hear about and assign to all of us. But there's an implicit part of our identity that I think we might take even a little more seriously, which is so many people around the world don't think they necessarily want to become Americans.
That was my next question,
but
actually.
they
Is this a
recognize
positive
this-
thing?
It's a positive thing. They recognize this as an arena where they would like to become the best version of themselves. And the reason why, after many years of living in China, I've ended up being so positive on America's prospects in the long run, is as long as we can be the place where an outsized proportion of the world's talented people think they can make a difference here, then that is a huge advantage that no one else can match. I'll say one other thing. For the last almost 2 years now, Deb and I have been flying around the country looking at smaller cities as they've been coping with economic shocks or one thing or another. And there's a fascinating role of American identity we've seen there, which is strong local patriotism. And how would you like, you're the broadcast professional here, closer or farther away? So there's strong local patriotism, which is indirectly reflecting on the American identity because people think about Allentown, Pennsylvania, or Greenville, South Carolina, or Columbus, Mississippi, or Fresno, California. They think it still has the virtues they don't believe the rest of America still has. But there is a kind of sense that what we would think of as the good parts of the American identity are still present in places where people are doing this in their own local communities.
That's great. Ashanti.
Thank you. So I grew up in Oakland, California, and I grew up poor. I grew up with a single mother on welfare. My father died before I was born. So I didn't have a lot of conversations about what it meant to be American growing up. I just knew that I had to work really hard, and life was tough. My mom was raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. The reason she came to California was because my grandmother told her, "You're gonna get us killed if you keep running your big mouth." Because my mom would not allow people to talk to her anyway. So she basically got sent away from Little Rock, Arkansas. My mom went to Central High School. But she taught me growing up, every year, PBS would have a show Roots, and she would make sure every year we would sit home and we would watch every episode. And she taught me about what my history was about. And so I grew up knowing that I was black and that there were some issues in our country that I needed to know about. But in Oakland, I didn't have to worry about them because everyone was black and brown, the people I dealt with. I didn't realize about my Americanness until I got to college. And when people told me, the only reason you got here was because of affirmative action. You got here because they had to let a few of you in. And I had to get really well versed on who I was as an American, being really clear that if we're gonna call this America, then we're all Americans. But if I'm gonna be American because I was born here, then this is my country. And so it was a lot growing up trying to figure out, well, how do I identify when this society doesn't let me feel like I fit into the mold? And so this is a great question. I think for me, when I work with our young men, talking to them about what's going on in our country now, they don't say, Branch, why are they killing Americans? To me. They ask me, why are they killing all the black men? And so my question to them always is around, well, what are your thoughts about it? Because I want them to be reflective and conscious about it. But I'm going to stop there because that's my answer about my identity as American. I think, I've answered that. I've asked myself that question many times. And now as an educator, as a person who grew up and realized that I had to work really hard, and then I was going to come back and give back to my community so that I can show them the way out. That's what it's about for me.
Thanks. Full disclosure, when I first met Michelle, I discovered it was a black woman from Minnesota, and I didn't know such a thing existed. So let's talk about identity.
When I think about identity, Gwen, I think about it as a Minnesotan, as a black woman, as a journalist, as someone who curates a project where stories about identity land in the inbox all the time. And I think about it most particularly around this time of the year because I was raised by a family that was deeply patriotic, my father in particular. On July 4th every year, he had a drawer where he kept little flags, and he would put them out in his beautiful garden, and he had socks that literally had the American flag on them. And as I got older and learned more about his story and his service in the military, I realized that he loved a country that didn't love him back. He was someone who was looking at this country that he loved, but at the margin, and saying, I too sing America, I too am American. And when we think about American identity, where it sometimes gets pinched is when we adorn it with adjectives. So someone who is truly American, someone who is genuinely American, someone who is unabashedly American. And that's when the definition gets very, very narrow. And they think that the idea of being an American, being all-American, when you think about all-American, you think of white picket fences and quarterbacks and apple pie. Well, in America, the concept of being all-American right now is to have salsa instead of ketchup, is to watch soccer instead of baseball. And so the notion of being American is not necessarily set in stone. I think of it more like water on a rock. And the water is the people who come to America and the way that they add to Americanness through the traditions that they bring and the outlook that they bring and the way that they want to define Americanism. So when I think of what it means to be American, it's not necessarily the card that you carry in your wallet. It's not necessarily the status that you have or the adjective that adorns your version of America or the hyphen even. It's what you do as an American to push the country forward. It's how you contribute to America to create the kind of America that you want to live in.
Hey, Jen.
So I think about the American identity through my experience growing up Asian American in an immigrant family, also raised by my grandmother, who's 89 and my personal heroine. And also a part of an organization that represents domestic workers and caregivers. And when we have our meetings, we have simultaneous interpretation in 7 different languages. And one time we did an audit of all the different countries represented in the room, and there were 74. And so that is the sense of the place of American identity that I live in and come from. And so I think of this quote that Dr. Vincent Harding, the great civil rights leader, often said, which is that I am a citizen of a country that has yet to come into being. And I think that the American identity is a work in progress, just like the American democracy is a work in progress. And I think our identity should be as stewards of the next expression of what the American experience and experiment should look like. And I think that that looks like a range of things that are changing. And in this moment, there's so much changing about our racial demographics, our age demographics, our economic reality, the way that work works. And so we have to be also aware and inclusive of all the ways in which American identity is reflected back through that change.
Great. John?
Thank you. And when I think of my identity, it's not terribly complicated. I've always thought of myself as an American. I'm fortunate to live in the greatest country in the world. Notwithstanding all the challenges we have, I've had the privilege of traveling around the world, and we are the envy of the world, without a doubt. Having said that, the American dream that I got to be part of is no longer available for everybody, so I do recognize that. But the best way to describe the way I think about myself is when I left the South Bronx in the mid-'70s and went to work for a firm called Deloitte. What the kids in the neighborhood called me was Jose Jaime Echevarria. So my mother called me, and Deloitte turned me into Joe Echevarria. And that's the way I think about it. That's the immigrant story, that's the American dream. And we change part of the world as we go along. America changes as we go along, but it's still the greatest nation in the world. And that's the reason why. Thank you. And that's the reason why there's so many people who want to get here, because they want a chance at that dream. Our challenge is just to make sure that the people who are already here have a chance at the dream. And the journey I was able to take, others can take.
I can't ask the questions of my panelists without answering it myself. I was born of immigrants who came to this country from the West Indies. I had an incredible appreciation for people who thought it was, who did the bold act of uprooting themselves from everything they knew in order to make a better life for their children. We were like Michelle's father, craziest patriots on the block. It never occurred to us that we were an American. In fact, we had chosen to become Americans, which seemed like a very empowering thing. But as in my current role, as I report day after day after day, all of our shortcomings in America, our shortcomings as Americans, I struggle, not with my patriotism or my love of the country, but to figure out how can we get over the humps, not the conversations, not the round tables, but how do we see each other? How do we begin to see ourselves and then see each other? It's so hard. We've discussed it in many, many different sessions here so far at Aspen, and it keeps returning in an interesting way to that theme, no matter what the topic is. So what we really want to do is hear that from you. You may have a question from the audience for the panel, or you may just have an observation that you want to share with us. Either way, we're going to spend the rest of our time here hearing back from you. Now, if you just raise your hands, I will do a little my best Phil Donahue and come and find you, so everybody else can hear you too. Not all at once. I knew I should have seated this audience. Hello. No, I'm not going to run. The air is way too thin to run. Hi.
Hi, I'm Janine. My name is Belle, Jinnyn, which makes me unique. There's only two of us in the world, me and my cousin who has the same name. I am a code switcher. I am racially ambiguous, which means that in many countries, I can just sort of fit in. I'm white, I'm Latina, I'm Middle Eastern, I'm Irish, I'm Scottish, and it makes for, and I'm a woman. And I'm a woman who's lived in the Middle East, which has its own set of interesting dynamics. But one of the things that I wanted to bring to the panel is what is life like for those of us who maybe are a little bit racially ambiguous? Those of us who can, maybe go undercover, but yet be advocates for the communities in which we represent.
Thank you. Michelle, you get a lot of these kinds of comments in your race card file, so give us a couple of the answers.
First of all, we might need to help the audience with the definition of code switching. So do you want to take
Yes,
that on?
code switching is when I am on the air and I say, tonight the news is, and then I go home and say, girl, let me tell you what the news was.
And I'm usually the one that gets that phone call. So if you heard the two of us talking as we do every single day, we don't necessarily sound the way we do when we're behind microphones. That's code switching. But lots of people do that. And that is not necessarily a negative thing. That's being bicultural. In the way that being bilingual will help you move forward in the world, being bicultural will help you. Jim, when you travel around, I imagine that you code switch to some degree.
Yes, and so I will tell you about the code switching cue I wanted to talk about, just something to connect with what Ashanti was saying. A reason I thought, one of the many reasons the president's speech this last week was so important, I thought, was not simply the glory of the composition of that speech, which I thought was a masterfully crafted speech, but the fact that by his own code switching, he embodied rather than explained the fact that he encompassed all these different strands of America in himself.
But when people talked about it, when journalism,
Yes.
when our profession talked about it, they talked about it as if it was this strange thing, like he was taking off one hat and putting on another, that it was strategic when it's something that people of color do all the time. And I posit that people all over the place, if you were Southern, I bet that you can be as country as a sugar sandwich when you go home.
It's true.
And yet when you walk into the workplace, that somehow drops.
So when we lived in Japan, our two sons, who were then in elementary school, they both had bright blonde hair, bright blue eyes, went to Japanese public school. The school I went to had never before had a non-Japanese student there. They learned two things. One was all about code switching, the way they could speak, colloquial Japanese and English with us and all the rest. The other thing that I actually did an Atlantic article about is I said every white American should have to go to Japanese school for a year or two to recognize what it's like to be aware of your race every second. Every second your race was the first thing about you. And as a white American, I say, race doesn't really matter. But so they learn to code switch, and as foreigners, you do that too. And so, yes.
The last thing I will say about that's most reflective in the Race Card Project is the question of where are you really from? Because you're talking about being able to live in lots of different places and code switch, but on the other side of that equation is someone who looks at you and in their mind is going through the mental calculation, what is she? Do I just assume something or do I ask? And that's, for me, in the inbox, that's one of the most frequent submissions I get, some version of where are you really from? Or, who are you really?
I have another question over here, panel to your left.
You're going to hold that mic. Okay, cool. So I was in Europe speaking at a conference, and a guy from Finland came up to describe his opinion of America, and I want to give it now. He asked everyone in the room, mostly not from America, how many people thought that America was on the downturn, was sinking, and most hands went up. And then he said, let me tell you why you're wrong. If I move to France and I have a child with a French woman, that child will never be French. If I move to Japan, generations, that child will never be Japanese. I could go to America right now, become a citizen in 7 years, and I'm American. And that made me feel really, really good. And that's the strength, I think, of this country, is that we're a melting pot, and we get the best when we can. And so I just want to say that.
Elizabeth?
Well, to your point, I think that it's important to think about the way that we have always been. This is to immigration. What does it mean to be an immigrant nation, not just now, but from the outset? If you go and look at very, very early American literary anthologies, the first ones by English people who had just come to this country, they were not Americans, they became Americans. They're writing about what does it mean to be American? And I think that part of the energy that is great about here is about that constant movement and turnover, but not without, of course, the terrible, terrible, you can't even call them growing pains, of the resistance to who gets to be called original, who calls themselves original, and when do we say immigration began, right? Immigration is not new. I think also I wanted to add to the very interesting question that was asked over here about code switching. I think that to your specifics, I think that for people who are in bodies that are ambiguously readable, and I'm sure in some places, when you're with your aunties, they know just what you are, right? But that you talk about going undercover, and I think that for people who are ambiguously readable, it is crucial to bear witness to the kind of xenophobia that people have against each other that you sometimes might have the misfortune to witness. You have to be a righteous ally if you are in that position. And I think it's also really important to point out, so this is really just speaking to the two questions, which bodies are inescapable right now in America? What does it mean to be in a body that is not ambiguous? You know, what does it mean to be my black sons walking on the street in those bodies all the time? It means many things. It doesn't all mean dangerous and bad things, but it also does mean a kind of vulnerability, and no one is going to read them out of those bodies. So I think that's an important thing to recognize as well.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving along so we can get as many questions as possible. Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. My question has to do with narrative creation, specifically for African Americans. I find often that we're talked about as a monolith, that we're coming from situations of poverty. We don't have our fathers, things of that nature, and it's absolutely true. But at what point does that narrative become the only defining narrative for the Black community, and in some instances, hurt other efforts that are happening? I particularly work in economic development and with entrepreneurs, and I feel as though I'm oftentimes always starting the conversation with, no, this is not social services, when I'm talking to people who are not Black. As though I need to start with that as the baseline, because to be Black means that you are poor. To be Black means that you don't have education. And I always have to communicate that we're not a monolith. So I'd love, for us to talk about what is a new narrative that can be created for the fact that the Black community and communities of color are very varied in this country.
Let me ask Ashanti to take that one on.
So I want to make sure I understood the question. So then what new narrative do we need to tell ourselves, or what narrative do we need to let everyone else know?
I think what opportunities should we be taking to continue to talk about additional narratives that exist in our community? Because I think oftentimes we spend time talking about one as though it is the only narrative that exists.
Thank you. So my job on a daily basis, I'm a vice principal at a middle school. And so as you imagine, I'm a seventh grade administrator this year. They have an opinion about everything. And so the narrative for our seventh grade class this year was, be your best self. Now I work at a school that's in the hills of Oakland, so 50% of our kids come from the hills, and 50% come from the heartland of Oakland. So we have a very diverse, we're one of the most diverse schools in Oakland. And what the narrative for our students, our white students, our African American, our Latino students, is really my questions to them is always around whatever incident happens, fight, behavior, is what are you trying to be right now? Like, who are you trying to be? Like if you're the receiving end of it, what happened? Why do you think it happened? Is it about the color? I think for me, that narrative for our young people, we have to start the narrative earlier. For our young people, if you're a young person of color growing up in a poor environment and you don't have a lot of resources, you could get stuck into the narrative that, well, there's no resources for me, so therefore I can't do anything. But my job, I believe, is to help them see past that. What do you want to happen in your life? And then really giving them tools so that they can reach for those tools. That's how I believe we change the narrative.
Can I ask Joe to weigh in on that too briefly?
Sure, and it's interesting because if you look at this from a Hispanic lens, that's a label in of itself. And if you ask the Hispanic person, are you Hispanic or are you Latino or Latina? People don't know how to answer that. If you ask that to my mother, she would say, I don't know where this Latin thing came from. We're Hispanic. Why? Because she views herself being associated somehow with the Spanish from Europe. And she likes that association better. If you asked me, Puerto Rican, I'm from the Bronx, what are you talking about? I don't know anything about this Hispanic thing. And I think the challenge is your narrative has to be focused on what it is you're trying to accomplish. And I think to try to get it all into one narrative is hard. And so your narrative needs to be incredibly focused to the audience you're expressing the narrative to. So in My Brother's Keeper, the narrative is very focused. It's not about the ones who've done it. It's about the ones who have not. And we're not trying to paint a brush around that. We're just trying to identify that a disproportionate number have not yet had the dream. Doesn't mean there aren't some that did. They just happen to be the minority, no pun intended. So I think that's a challenge. Like I said, even in my own race, when we get into politics, I say, you shouldn't talk about the Cubans and immigration. They have political asylum. Don't talk about the Puerto Ricans. We got rights to this country in the 50s. We're not the ones voting on immigration. It's interesting, though. The narrative is quite complicated in race. It was much simpler in gender because everybody was touched at some point by a woman in their life. Race is really complicated, very complicated.
Okay, I'm back here, straight back with another question.
Okay, my question is kind of about the American dream, which is something that many of you talked about in your American identity. Do you think the American dream is dead, and that idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and, you know, having a white picket fence is something that no longer exists? Is that something that has changed into something else, or is it that something that is altogether non-existent anymore?
Jen.
Well, I think the topic of this conversation throughout this festival in terms of the endangered American dream is a topic because I think that there are real threats to the future of the American dream and that there have been real barriers to many communities for a long time in being able to achieve the dream. And that's what we're here to talk about, is how do we unlock that? How do we take this moment of change when our economy is changing, when our demographics are changing, to actually seize upon opportunities to strengthen the American dream and make it the inclusive dream that it was always meant to be. I think that there are some real realities. The fact that real wages haven't increased for 30 years, that low-wage work is expanding, that 2/3 of all minimum wage workers are women, many of whom are mothers. There are a lot of real hard economic realities out there, and still millions of people without work. And so I think we have to really look honestly at those challenges and come up with solutions, develop solutions in our culture, in our systems, in our policy that actually reopen up the American dream, which will look different in this new moment in the 21st century. It's a moment of opportunity and reinvention.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time left, so I have somebody who promises to make a really quick comment from an indigenous perspective, and then I'm going to take the final question.
Okay. Hamitakuyepi, Yushkian Wachiankapiye, Carly Badharpel and Makyapiye. I said, hello, my friends and relatives. My name is Carly Badharpel. I'm happy to see you all here today. I'm excited to be here. I just wanted to, I felt a responsibility to say something as an indigenous person to this land. I'm Dakota from the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe. And our people very often are left out of the conversation in many ways. I had the honor of speaking on a panel at this festival where we talked just about that. And so I just want to encourage everyone, as we're having conversations like this, please remember to include our indigenous people, because when you look at the disparities across this country, our indigenous people are at the bottom. And very often that is not mentioned. And there's a lot of work to be done in those communities, and we ask that you reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Talk about original American identity. I'm glad we got that in. Last question.
Hello, my name is Stella from Mozambique, student at African Leadership Academy. I have a question. Imagine that you are black. What will be your position in racism? And for everyone, another question is, become a leader or work for community. What would you like, or what would you die for?
I think that's something everybody can give us a brief answer to. Starting with you, Elizabeth.
The question being, I heard the second part is, what would you die for?
Yes.
And the first part?
Imagine that you are black.
Imagine that. I don't have to imagine.
Yes, okay. Okay, don't imagine, feel.
Yes.
Close your eyes and feel that you are black. What will be your position about racism?
About racism. I'm a black woman who comes from a long line of race people, as we call them. And I was always taught that struggling in any way, if you struggle with poems, if you struggle in your small community, if you struggle as a teacher, if you try to change housing laws, if you try to bring more job opportunities to people, that it's your responsibility to remember Anna Julia Cooper's words, when and where I enter, the whole race enters with me. And you can substitute for race, we all move forward together in a better way. What would I die for? My children. That's it.
Jim, our token white guy.
Yes, the what I would die for answer was going to be the same. My children, my family, the opportunities of those I love. I'm a white man who spent a lot of time in places where I was the minority, sometimes a favored minority, sometimes not. I've thought a lot about the mixture of race in our country. On the one hand, the great success of America is that immigration is always disruptive, always painful, but we've been able to take it better than other countries have. So we've been able to have its benefits, notwithstanding our two original sins involving race. One is the treatment of the Native Americans, the other is slavery and its aftermath. And so Deb and I have been in a lot of reservations recently, and I very much echo those. So I think that to view America from inside and outside is to recognize we struggle with these legacies of our original sins.
Ashanti.
On racism, that's a really tough question. And I feel like I could feel myself getting excited about that question. So what I would say about racism is that we have work to do in this country. And if we don't open our eyes to what's going on in our communities, we are going to have a lot more trouble in our communities. What I die for, what I work every day for, is creating a world of freedom, teaching our youth to break their chains so they can live more free.
Michelle, we have to wrap this up really quickly, so quick answers.
What I would die for my children who are here in this room, this tent with me. But I hope that in some ways in the distance, and so I choose to live strongly and aggressively and boldly toward making the world a better place for them. On the question of being a black woman, I am a black woman, and where and when I enter, I represent a multitude of black women, and so I hope that you all think about the danger of a single story that we all represent, and that's true for all of us, whether you are a blonde woman, whether you're a white male financier, whether you're an American Indian. There are many stories, and they cannot be told through one narrow narrative.
Hi, Jen.
Black Lives Matter. And I'm a part of a group of Asians who call themselves Asians for Black Lives. And I am because I believe that until we address the many ways in which we've valued Black lives differently in this country, that we won't ever achieve the kind of healthy democracy that we know we all deserve. And that's the democracy that I would die for, because that's the democracy that I know my kids and everyone here deserves.
Joe.
49 seconds. I'm looking at the timer.
You can do it.
I can do this. First of all, what I would do is try to remind everybody to, as much as you like to live in a circumstance, you need to live in the vision. It's very different. And what would I die for? It's not terribly complicated besides what was already said. I die solely for one thing, the freedom that you're granted in the United States of America. That's what I die for.
Please thank my panel.
Thank you very much. The notion of an American dream and equal opportunity is, of course, very much of a nonpartisan and non-ideological one. And there's nobody in America who has fought as much for equal opportunity and expanding opportunity for all Americans as Congressman Paul Ryan. Congressman Ryan is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, a fifth-generation Janesville, Wisconsin family, somebody who is fighting and has fought, and I assume will continue to fight, for the notion of expanding economic opportunity. Interviewing him is Bill Kristol, my friend, who exactly 20 years ago started the Weekly Standard. He still edits it, proving he can't get another job, but has been one of the great intellectual beacons of opportunity in America. Bill, Congressman Ryan, thank you.
Thanks, Walter, and it's great to be here with you all. Great to be interviewing Paul Ryan, who I'll just add 2 sentences to Walter's introduction. I guess I've known, in my years in Washington, most of the major figures, certainly on the Republican side of the aisle. And not only is Paul Ryan one of the most dedicated public servants of those figures, he's one of the nicest people, actually, to have attained prominence in Washington. Maybe you're not aware of this, that not everyone who succeeds in Washington is really very nice. And not everyone who's very nice succeeds in politics, but Paul is an exception to the rule and really a wonderful person, as well as an intellectual leader and a political leader for Republicans and conservatives. So it's a pleasure to interview you. He's coming off a big legislative victory. Let's begin briefly with that. As chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, he shepherded through the free trade agreement, the authorization for the president to at least have fast-track ability to get his free trade agreement through Congress. Just last week in Congress, a rare bipartisan moment where a huge majority of Republicans followed Paul's lead in giving the president authority he wanted. Most Democrats voted against it. How did that happen, and what do we learn from that?
Well, first of all, when I heard the thunder and the lightning, I thought that was the cue for the Republicans to enter the stage, when we got here. So it's great to be here. Walter, thank you for your hospitality. I really appreciate it. What was important about the moment we just had, which is, like you said, Bill, rare, was a bipartisan accomplishment, which is we established Trade Promotion Authority so that the president can go get trade agreements for America. We have not had the ability to do this since 2007 when it last lapsed. What has happened since 2007 is there have been 100 trade agreements negotiated and put in place around the world since then, and we have been a party to none of them. What this means is other countries are going around the world getting better agreements between each other, and that means America's barriers against our exports going into other countries is getting higher and higher and higher, and we're losing as a result. The question is not, are we going to rewrite the rules of the global economy? The rules are being written right now. The question is, who's going to write them? And so what we believed is it's important for America to get back in the game. It's important for America to lead. And we believe that no matter who the president is, we should go out and try and knock down trade barriers to our products so we can make more things in America, sell them overseas, and have America holding the pen when they're rewriting the rules for the global economy. And so, yes, this is one of those cases where Republicans joined with this president to do that. And I think it was very important for our country and very important for jobs.
And how hard was it to persuade your fellow Republicans in the House, as well as in the Senate, to give the president his top legislative priority, give him more authority, actually, to negotiate, more leeway? This is not a party that trusts this president normally to give him more authority.
I would argue it's not giving him more authority. It's just giving him the ability to go get an agreement and then bring it back to Congress, and then Congress decides at the end of the day whether or not we accept an agreement. But we sure have to try. And more importantly, our allies are wondering, are we going to be in the game? Are we going to stay America? Are we going to write the rules? We're in the middle of negotiating with 11 Pacific nations, not China, but other Asian nations, and they want to play by our rules. They want to adopt our free enterprise system. They want to use America as a counterweight to China, and we want access to their markets so we can sell our products and have more jobs. So it was making an economic and a foreign policy argument to our members, who, mostly Republicans. You're right. Look, I ran against the guy in the last election. I mean, good grief.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, so, thanks. So there was this, why are we helping this president do this? Because it's right for the country. And we impressed upon our members that we believe in free trade, and we think it's right for the country. And we need this, not just for this president, for the next president. And so I think we prevailed on that. In the House, we had 191 Republican votes, 28 Democrats. We had 14 Democrats join us in the Senate. Most Republicans in the Senate supported this. So this is one of those rare opportunities that we've had. We're going to see if we can parlay this into a few other accomplishments this year. But if America, on a bipartisan basis, told the world, we're not going to try to get trade agreements, we don't want to engage, we don't want to write the rules of the global economy, think of the punctuation mark that would have placed upon this narrative that America's in decline. We, as Republicans, can say, look, we don't agree with his foreign policy. We don't agree with Iran and Russia and ISIS. But if we said we're also going to participate in stopping trade and not negotiating trade agreements, then the rest of the world would say, oh, this isn't an aberration of these 8 years. This is America now. America's past its prime. And I do not want to see this narrative being perpetuated that America is past its best days. I want to perpetuate in America that we're getting back on track, we're going to fix our country, we're confident, and we're going to lead.
Let's talk about one aspect of the domestic side of that. We ran into Bob Putnam out there, and we were talking about his fine new book and Charles Murray's book of a couple of years ago, both of which focus very much, of course, on challenges, obstacles, barriers to upward mobility in America, the apparent inability of some of the old ways of doing things, maybe on both the left and right, to address poverty. You've taken a lead on poverty in the last couple of years. Talk about that.
Yeah, so when you and I knew each other back in the 90s, I was working for Jack Kemp, working on his poverty initiatives back in those days, thinking that we could make a difference. We did welfare reform and a couple of other things. And when we saw the 50th anniversary and the war on poverty coming up last year, I and some others decided to take a deep dive into this issue. Toured the country for 2 years with a friend of mine, Bob Woodson, an old civil rights leader from the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, touring poor communities throughout the country and listening to people who are on the front lines of the war on poverty. And spent a year scrubbing through the federal government, through the budget, through all the programs that we have, measuring whether or not programs are succeeding or not, to come up with a conclusion that I think is indisputable, which is we're not winning the war on poverty. Read Bob Putnam's book, by the way. It's a fantastic book. He does a very good job of showing where we're going in America. And let me just say a couple of things. Number one, we had a 50-year war on poverty, and we now measure success based upon inputs, based on our effort. How many programs do we have? How much spending are we committing to this program? How many people are on these programs? We are not measuring success in the war on poverty based upon whether we're getting people out of poverty or not, based on results. And this is the kind of dialogue change that has to happen. So another bipartisan effort, Patty Murray and I, she's a senator from Washington. I've worked with her on bills before. We hope later this summer we're going to pass a bill changing our measurement system of program success based on outcomes, not on inputs. And we want to have that kind of a conversation, because if we simply focus on the old fight, it's going to be Republicans against Democrats, liberals against conservatives, not what works and what doesn't work. And if we can switch this fight to what works and what doesn't work, then I feel like we can make progress, because where we are today, upward mobility is stagnant. If you were raised poor, you are just as likely to stay poor today as you were 50 years ago. So we have an economic mobility problem in America. It's not for lack of trying, it's not for lack of resources, it's for lack of creativity, it's for lack of effective planning. And the other thing I would say is, we took this notion that Washington can manage this situation from the top down, have a bunch of bureaucracies, make them efficient, and they can manage this. That doesn't work. It isn't working. And when you add up all of these poverty programs we have, it has basically created this perverse incentive called a poverty trap, where it pays you not to work. If you're a single mom with one child and you make the minimum wage and you're on Medicaid, housing assistance, food stamps, and you get the earned income tax credit, if you get offered a job that pays you $3 an hour more per hour, you add up what it looks like. You take into consideration your taxes and the benefit losses you will get by taking that better job, and you will only get to keep 10 cents on every extra dollar you earn. So the highest marginal tax rate isn't Bill Kristol or Walter Isaacson or probably just about everybody in this building. The highest marginal tax rate is that single mom making $25,000 a year who's losing 80 to 90 cents on the dollar when she tries to take a leap of faith and go work. So these are things we have to deal with. We have to make work pay. We have to make work work. And so that's why I think we need to overhaul our safety net, because the safety net's designed to catch people falling into poverty. It's really not designed to get people out of poverty. And that's why I think we need to take a new approach and respect people on the front lines who are doing the effective poverty fighting. Listen to them, learn from them, get behind them. Government can provide resources, but government's screwing up the implementation of this, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Let me ask one more policy question, and then maybe a word or two about that 2012 campaign, which I'd successfully blocked out for the last two or 3 years until you reminded me of it. And that's on entitlements. I think no one has done more to call attention to the challenge of dealing with entitlements than you have. And in Washington. You brought the Republican Party against all predictions around to your plan to begin to curb entitlement growth. You've worked with Democrats like Patty Murray on that to some degree as well. Are we going to get entitlements under control, and can we do it responsibly? I saw Donald Trump attack you the other day for said it was Donald Trump, who's a noted political expert, he's been elected so many times to things, said Paul Ryan's political judgment was horrible, and the party would suffer if it followed the Paul Ryan road on entitlements. So.
Well, let me just say he doesn't speak for me. First of all, we have to get a handle on entitlements. The question that I don't know the answer to is, can we do it responsibly? Meaning, can we do it now on our own terms as a country, or do we wait till we have a European-like moment where we've got a debt crisis on our hands? What we've been advocating is patient-centered healthcare, where people have more control over their healthcare. They and their doctors run the decision-making process, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, or health insurance for people under 65. Healthcare is the big issue. Healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are the big three, they say. And in about 15 or 20 years, they'll consume 100% of all federal revenues, meaning no money for anything else we do, for defense, education, environment, nothing. So that's the path we're on. And it's basically because baby boomers are retiring and far fewer people are following them in the workforce, and the programs they use go up in spending 6 to 8% a year. So we have to change the way these programs work so that we can better fulfill their mission, but without bankrupting the country, because we have tens of trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities. The answer to your question is, we already know enough through the witness of our private economy that competition and choice, it works. Peter Thiel's sitting right over here. I mean, you can bring costs down and quality up in the private economy. Why can't we do that in these areas, like our health and retirement security? The answer is we can, but we're not. And so the kinds of reforms that we're proposing, which involves more individual choice, more innovation, more customization, more markets, we believe is how to fix this. And what I mean responsibly is, the sooner we do this, the sooner it doesn't affect anybody in or near retirement. So the political transition is gradual. It's easy. You're not taking anything away from somebody who already retired based upon the promise that government made to them. But if we do keep kicking this can down the road, which for the last 8 years we have, and not tackle this entitlement problem, then we will have a mess on our hands. It will look European-like. We'll have a run on the bond markets. Who knows what it does to our currency? But more importantly, we will have no choice but to pull the rug out from other people who have already retired. So our goal is to fix this before it becomes ugly. And I think the kinds of reforms we're talking about make them better. Give you more control over your life, more control over your health care, and get at the root cause of inflation. Actually have a healthcare sector where people want to go into this sector, where doctors are free to innovate, where we have a free market that works. There's no reason why we can't do that. We spend more money than anybody else on healthcare than any other country. We just don't spend it intelligently.
And I do think, turning to the 2012 election, you were put on the ticket, and that was going to be so difficult to defend the Medicare cuts, so-called cuts in the Republican budget that you had worked on and led through the House. And in fact, whatever the causes of 2012, no one thinks that contributed much one way or the other.
We won the
right?
senior vote by double digits. My mom and I ran around Florida doing town hall meetings on Medicare for about a month. And we won the senior vote by double digits.
And so what did you learn? I'm just curious, very few of us, obviously, have gone through the kind of campaign that you went through. And you do, one great advantage, one reason I respect elected officials so much is both that they put their name on the line and risk defeat, and also that they do deal with actual Americans. You deal with them in your district in Wisconsin, which is a very sort of middle American district, I think a 50-50 Democratic-Republican district, middle class, but you also deal with them when you're running for vice president or president of the United States. I'm just curious, what surprised you about the campaign? What would surprise us about your experiences on the road for those incredibly intense 2.5 months, either the VP campaign or also being an elected official, being a congressman from the 1st District of Wisconsin?
Yeah, in 2012, I guess I learned one important lesson. The Electoral College really matters. There's a point in that, and the point is, for Republicans, for conservatives, we have to show really who we are and what we believe and what we're trying to do. We have to be a big tent where we include people and bring people in. And I believe that if you take our principles, the founding principles, liberty, freedom, free enterprise, self-determination, government by consent of the governed, these are really important principles that made us so special in the first place. to more perfect the American idea, which I've heard from people just in the last, a lot of people don't believe in the American idea anymore. The condition of your birth determines the outcome of your life, doesn't determine the outcome of your life. You know, you can make it if you work hard. If you make a mistake in America, you can redeem yourself. There are a lot of people who don't believe that that is there for them. So it's our job to show how it can be, how we take our principles, apply them to the problems of the day to show real solutions that involve everybody. Better ideas for effectively fighting poverty and reigniting upward mobility. Better ideas for actually solving healthcare problems, getting this debt under control. A better foreign policy to make us safer and stronger and more respected. Faster economic growth, by the way. Underneath all of this, we need to grow our economy a heck of a lot faster, and we have the potential to, and we're not. And I would argue, but for our government, in so many ways, we're not. And so what I learned is we have to have a more candid conversation with the country and do it in a way that is inclusive, that is appealing, that is aspirational and relatable, and campaign everywhere. You know, not just the handful of states, but everywhere, to really try to show this election for the high stakes of election that it really is. And that's the kind of election I want to have. And I believe in specifics. And this is something that, you know, I've been hit for this a lot. Tell people who exactly you are, what you plan to do if elected, and then if you win that election, then you have the moral authority. Then you've won the mandate. Then you can go do it. And so I think the days of the vague platitudes or the personality contest, those got to go away. And who are we? What are we going to do? What is the program? What are we planning? And why are we doing this? And why do we believe this? That's the kind of election I think we have to have for us to be successful. And that's the kind of election I just yearn to see in this country. And for as far as just being elected in Congress, people are really nervous about the future. The anxiety is palpable. Some are doing well, some communities are doing okay, but it's palpable. Whether it's threats from overseas or just the fear that your child is not going to have the kind of opportunities that even you had. That's palpable. And good thing for us and good thing for this country, it's overcomable. We can fix it. But that's what's going on in America, I would say. Deep-seated anxiety, people giving up, especially in poor communities. And I do believe, for one, we need to have a clarifying election, get through that, and I think we can.
Would you like to make news here at the Aspen Ideas Festival?
No, I would not.
Tell us. I'll finish that sentence anyway.
15 people.
And tell us who you would, which Republican candidate would you like to endorse here? You would like to know. You know?
Yeah. So
it's off the record, really.
We know each other pretty well.
The fact that it's being live streamed around, no one will pay attention.
So, given that I am the chair of the general fund for the party, I'm in this role where I'm helping prepare for the nominee when that person arrives, because one of the mistakes we think we made is we had to scramble to create a general election campaign against an incumbent late. So what we're doing is we're pre-building the campaign right now, so when that, the bricks and the mortar and the data and all of the things that you have to do, so that when that person arrives, it's kind of a turnkey operation, which is a long, multi-sentence way of saying I'm not going to answer his question.
And you're not going to
neutral.
And you're not going to reconsider your decision not to run?
No, I'm not going to.
Okay, I give up. Tell me, you mentioned, I think, foreign policy in passing. I don't want to dwell on that. There are other good panels, like Dave Petraeus is speaking here in a second, isn't he? But defense, one of the things the Republican budget did this year, President's budget also, after many years of cutting defense, increases defense a bit or stops the hemorrhaging in defense, the way one might put it. The Republicans also tried to do the same. Talk about that. I mean, that's an area I know that you had been, you've been more involved in that than people realize. I think of you in the entitlements, poverty, trade. Talk about the defense budget and what is necessary for our basic obligations around the world.
Yeah, I chair the Ways and Means Committee now, but I had been chairing the Budget Committee the last 2 terms. And so I had to put together a budget agreement with Patty Murray, who we mentioned earlier, to prevent defense from getting hit really hard in the last 2 years. That agreement is now expired, and so we're going into another fight over defense. We will see if the Senate can filibuster, the Democrats will filibuster the defense bill, and if they can, then we're going to have a fight over our military. Why does this matter? This matters because after Afghanistan and Iraq, we need to reset our force structure. You can imagine the kind of wear and tear that the equipment gets, number one. Number two, we're shrinking our brigades. We're shrinking our combat-ready brigades. And we have to keep our advantage on technology. And our Navy is getting very small. The budget the president sent us the week Putin invaded Crimea, he proposed to bring our Navy to a level we have not seen since before World War I. He proposed to bring our Army down to a level we haven't seen since before World War II. And he proposed to shrink our Air Force to a level we've never seen before. And so when governments do that, when America does that, it tempts others. It creates a vacuum. It shows a sense of vulnerability. And so we believe that that's very dangerous. So we've been trying to work on a bipartisan basis to prevent that from happening, or to at least reverse the slide and to rebuild our military so that we do have a honest-to-goodness peace through strength doctrine. We're going to have a fiscal fight this fall, much like the one Patty and I sort of worked on 2 years ago. Hopefully what will come out of that is keeping the military from getting sequestered again. But at the end of the day, because this president has given us 6 budgets that are just devastating to the military. The last 2 were not as bad. But he's not going to invest in what we think we need to have a strong. And the reason you want a big, strong military is if you ever use it, you want to make sure you're keeping people safe. You want to make sure that when you deploy troops, you have the resources and the manpower to be able to deploy enough so that who is being deployed are be deployed in the safest possible manner. That's number one. Number two, we do not want to give other countries this notion that they can catch up, so that they try. And that is, I think, one of our challenges with China, not so much with Russia, but one of our challenges with China. And this is something that is very dangerous, and we're on a very dangerous trajectory. But I believe we will probably have a fiscal fight, and my guess is we will have to put together another agreement, not unlike what we did before, to stop the Pentagon from getting hit really hard again. But we're going to have to rebuild our military in the next session of Congress with the next president.
Let me close with a question I hadn't really planned on asking, but since you mentioned China, on the one hand, you're a free trader, an engager in a sense with the world and with China. On the other hand, you've been hawkish on foreign policy, and then just recently we didn't even mention cybersecurity as part of the new expensive tasks our military and our intelligence community have to assume. We've got 1 minute and 42 seconds. You can explain the future of the U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah. We need to be strong. We need to be very strong, economically strong and militarily strong, to help in ascending China ascend properly, peacefully, to ascend in a way where it's American-style free enterprise that's being practiced. This is one of the reasons why I'm so strong of a believer in trade. This is one of the reasons why I fought tooth and nail with my party to get Barack Obama Trade Promotion Authority, because we are now in talks with the Japanese, with the Malaysians, with the Australians, with 11 Pacific nations, to have them agree to play by our rules, our intellectual property protections, our rule of law, our enforceable contracts, our cyber protection, give us access to their markets. And they want to play by our rules, the American-style system of free enterprise, versus the Chinese system of what I would call crony capitalism, intellectual property theft, and the rest, to serve as an effective counterweight to China. And that, to me, is one of the most important things we can do for an effective China policy, in addition to a bigger Navy. And people ask me, and my party especially, well, why is Obama doing this? He's not for free trade. I think he believes that his Asia rebalancing strategy is the best thing he can salvage from his foreign policy. The Cairo speech, ISIS in Syria fiasco, Russia reset didn't work. The rebalancing to Asia is still salvageable. 2 things you need to do for that. A bigger Navy, not going to do that. Trade, he's going to do that. And he's doing that. And I think he should be celebrated for doing that. And I think that's one of the best things we can do to put America in the driver's seat in Asia and in the world to write the rules of the global economy as our best China policy possible.
That's great. Well, Paul, I'll close by reminding you and everyone else that Bill Clinton did not get into the presidential race in 1991 until October 91, which means you still have, 3 months to reconsider your decision not to run in 2016.
I'm going to go hike the Ute Trail with my 10-year-old.
Go out on the Ute Trail with your 10-year-old, think hard about it, and reconsider. Anyway, thanks, Paul, so much for this.
Ladies and gentlemen, now for something completely different. We are very grateful at the Aspen Institute and the Ideas Festival to have an endowment for artists in residence. And this afternoon, we're going to treat you to the next Harmon Eisner, artist in residence, Cameron Carpenter, playing Toccata by J.S. Bach.
States. He's educated in California. He went to 7 elementary schools. He started chess at age 6. By 12, he was number 7 in the country in chess. He scored
in the under 12 category.
Under 12 category. I was older and I was playing him, and I did quite well, actually. Then he went to Stanford, majored in philosophy, Stanford Law School, clerked a little bit, did a little law, did a little bit of finance. Then he co-founded PayPal. He sold to eBay, making him, by Silicon Valley standards, a meaningless, barely bankable $50 million. Peter was 30 years old then. At 36, he became the first outside investor in Facebook. So let me put the question to you. It's 2004. Facebook has been around for just a few months. It has effectively 0 revenues, and Peter is offered the chance to buy 10% of Facebook for $500,000. Would you do that? He did it. It was a $1 billion gain within a decade. He remains on the board of Facebook. Started a hedge fund, started a venture capital fund, went on to become the co-founder of Palantir. Peter has an argument, I don't know whether we're going to have time to get to it or not, that he could reasonably, many people now could reasonably expect to live to 120 years. So let's just pause it for a moment. He's halfway through his life. When you read the literature, when you talk to his friends, what do you hear about him? These are the 3 things that I heard. Number 1, fiercely intelligent. That's the chess, math, Stanford part. Number 2, a public intellectual. He writes and speaks on government authority, moral legitimacy of higher education, the problem with elites, the rise of machine intelligence. The billionaire Silicon Valley investor Mark Andreessen said, and I'm quoting, "It's hard to be around Peter and not think I have to get smarter. When it comes to philosophy, history, politics, the fate of humanity, Peter has up-leveled the discussion a lot." What a lovely phrase, up-leveled the discussion. And number 3, he's known as being the great talent master of Silicon Valley. So he founded PayPal, and then his PayPal alums have gone on to found their own companies: LinkedIn, Tesla, SpaceX, YouTube, Yelp, Yammer, 20 other companies, market cap value of over $30 billion. This PayPal progeny, the alumni who have gone on, are called the PayPal Mafia, and Peter is called their dean. So let me revisit the starting question. Who wouldn't want to claim Peter as his son? This is going to be a little awkward here on the stage for a moment. You might want to find something to do. Peter, how would you feel about calling me Dad?
I feel pretty awkward about it, actually. But no, this is sort of introduction. It's all going to go downhill from here. This is like really, you're setting a bar unbelievably high for me.
And that concludes our time together.
You're
Thank
really
you for
tough
coming.
dad.
So let's humanize Peter, see if we can get him to answer a little bit of a personal question, then we'll go to the larger issues. The run I just gave is too full of success. There must have been some complexity about being thought of as a child prodigy or having that kind of attention focused on you. Talk about whatever that complexity was, and then tell the Supreme Court story.
Well, there's a way in which I grew up in a phenomenally tracked context at the end of the day. You know, in California, 8th grade, junior high school, one of my friends wrote in my yearbook, I know you're going to make it into Stanford 4 years later. 4 years later, you go to Stanford. Then 4 years after that, Stanford Law School. Probably the final sort of tracked credential that I thought I needed to get was a Supreme Court clerkship. Got interviews with 2 justices. They normally interview 8 people, pick 4. I missed it with both. At that point, I was just absolutely devastated. One of my friends who had helped coach me through the process, years later, we reconnected, and he sort of asked, he didn't ask me, how are you doing, or it's great talking to you, Peter. First question was, so aren't you glad you didn't get that Supreme Court clerkship? And there was sort of the sense, more generally, that in my 20s there was a super track thing. I ended up at a top law firm in Manhattan. It was one of these places where from the outside everybody wanted to get in, on the inside everybody wanted to get out. When I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall from me said, it was really reassuring to see that it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. And actually all you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. So it was a little bit easier than Alcatraz. But it was difficult because psychologically, so many of our identities get wrapped up in these competitions we win. And I think often the people who in our society who are very talented, very gifted, in some ways get tracked into this even more intensely than elsewhere. And I think we all, if we're going to build a better future, we need to do new things, and we can't all do the same tried and true things that have worked. And so I always try to get at these things indirectly. So it's, what great business is nobody building? The interview question I always like to ask is, tell me something that's true that very few people agree with you on. Somehow, how do we break the mold? How do we move out of it? And these are super hard questions for people to answer, even when they can read on the internet that you're going to ask the question of everybody who comes in the door. It's one of those questions that doesn't actually become easier when you know that it's going to be asked, because even though we all have some answers to these questions, they're very uncomfortable, because in the context of an interview or anywhere else, the answer is one that the person asking the question doesn't want to hear. If they agree with you, it's probably a bad answer, And so I do think this challenge from breaking from convention, being able to do new things, is a very acute one. Already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. There's something about human nature that's very deeply imitative. It's how kids learn language from their parents. It's how culture is transmitted in our society. But then there also are all these contexts where imitation goes badly wrong. It's the madness of crowds. It's market bubbles. It's all sorts of crazed manias that we've seen in recent decades. And so, you have this very strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where a number of the more successful people seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's. And I think we always need to flip this around into an indictment of our broader society, and we need to ask the question, what is it about our society where those of us who do not suffer from Asperger's are talked out of our interesting, creative, innovative ideas before they're even fully formed, where we sort of pick up on all these cues from the people around us and notice, oh, that's a little too weird, that's too strange, I better just stick with that Supreme Court clerkship.
Peter, you have some evolving views on higher education. There's some wonderful quotes. We have a bovine attitude towards academic degrees. Higher education is the next U.S. bubble. University administrators are subprime mortgage brokers, as if they were subprime mortgage brokers. Explain the argument.
Well, education is it is sort of seen as the absolute be-all and end-all, as the safe way to track things, and education is very good at training people to do the same things that we've done over and over again, and it's perhaps not as good at pushing some of these newer ideas. I think there are a whole set of challenges that have gone wrong. It's the costs have escalated faster than inflation since 1980, and more faster than any other category. And so there is sort of, and then there are all sorts of questions whether the kind of incredible tracking where kids are getting tracked already in preschool, certainly K through 12, is in some ways narrowing things and sort of socializing our younger people in ways that are less good than they appear. I think there's always a question what the nature of the educational good is. You can say it's an investment good, where you're investing in the future. You can say it's a consumption good, like college is a 4-year party. I think most of the parents and students think of it actually as an insurance policy, where you're buying this really ever more expensive insurance so that the students don't fall through the really big cracks in our society, and we should be asking some big questions why the insurance costs are going up and up like that. And I think that reflects some questions about our society. But then I think from the point of view of the colleges, it's not an insurance policy at all, but it's sort of a crazy tournament. And it's a zero-sum tournament. And if you were the president of Harvard or Stanford, if you wanted to get a lynch mob of students, alumni, faculty to come after you and try to lynch you, what you should say is something like this. We live in this much larger, more global world. We offer a great education to everybody, and so we're going to double or triple our enrollment over the next 15 to 20 years. And people they'd all be furious, because the value of the degrees comes from this massive exclusion, and what you're really running is something like a Studio 54 nightclub with this incredibly long line outside and a very small number of people let inside. It's branded as positive sum, everybody can learn, and the reality is deeply zero sum.
Peter and I had time to talk by phone last week. It was just a phone call. It wasn't that special, frankly. But thank you. So Peter and I had time to talk last week, and I said, so what's the big thing you're thinking about? What's the big thing you're talking about? And he said something contrarian. He said he's not overwhelmed by the pace of technological progress. He used words like stagnation, Groundhog Day. Flesh that argument out a little.
Well, I think one of the very important public policy questions in our society is how much technological progress is happening, because I think this is what's going to determine whether the quality of life is going to get better for people in our society in the decades ahead. And I'm not absolutely negative, but I'm probably slightly on the pessimistic end of the spectrum as Silicon Valley goes, which I think is always hyper optimistic on this question. And I think it's been, if we look at the past 40 years, it's been the story of quite rapid progress in computers, software, internet, mobile internet, in the world of bits. It's been much more limited progress in the world of atoms, whether it's energy, biotech has been more challenging. There have been more challenges in everything from transportation, space travel, all these things that people would have called technology in the 1950s and 60s, I would say have been much slower. So there's been a lot of progress in the world of bits, which have been quite unregulated, a lot less progress in the world of atoms, which for all sorts of reasons, both good and bad, have been much more heavily regulated. And I think the upshot is that when you look at things like the productivity growth numbers in the economy, the GDP growth rate, these things are actually somehow slower. And then we have all sorts of complicated debates whether these numbers don't measure things correctly. I think they're roughly correct, or they're no more distorted than they were 40 or 50 years ago. And so I think we have to take very seriously this idea that perhaps there's not as much progress as there has been in the past.
What decade was the golden age?
I think that in the 50s and 60s you had very rapid progress, but I think you would have had rapid innovation, even in the 30s, which were a horrible decade by almost every standard. From the point of view of technology, you had phenomenal progress. You had secondary oil recovery, you had the plastics revolution, household appliances, the movie industry, the aviation industry. So if you looked at all the new industries that were started in the 1930s and you contrast that, say, with the 2010s, it tells you that this is an era that's actually much worse than the 30s from the point of view of, say, technological innovation. So I think we had a lot more for maybe the 150 years before, and you could pick any decade like that.
You have a now famous quote about flying cars.
Well, it's probably been overdone, but it's basically that they promised us flying cars, and all we got was 140 characters, which and it's always I think it always gets misread as a bit too much of a negative thing on Twitter, because I think we have had a lot of very successful companies in Silicon Valley, and Twitter is a phenomenally valuable business. It came up with a new way to narrowcast communication. But of course, there's a sense that even though it can be great as a business, it's great for the 2,000 or 3,000 people who work at Twitter. They will have well-paying jobs for decades to come. There is a sense that that level of innovation is perhaps not enough to single-handedly take our civilization to the next level. And so I think we have a lot of stories of specific success, but they don't necessarily translate into this general societal improvement.
Peter published a book, wrote a book in 2014, which was a bestseller. It's called 0 to 1. I read it. It is astonishingly original, and it's just taken by storm all the young entrepreneur community. He was teaching a course at Stanford in 2012, and one of his students, Blake Masters, took notes and put his notes up online. They became a little bit of a sensation in Silicon Valley, and then David Brooks wrote a column about it. They ended up with 2.4 million page views on his notes. So he and his student wrote the book. Give the argument of the book.
Well, the contrast I try to start with is two different modes of innovation or progress. And I think we can have progress in the 21st century through globalization, where you copy things that work. It's going from one to N. China is the prototype of that, and there are ways in which that's worked incredibly well, and we can debate how well that's going to keep working from here on out. And then there is, and I always draw that on an x-axis and describe that as horizontal or extensive progress. And then there's doing new things, so copying things that work, globalization, and doing new things. That's technology. It's going from 0 to 1. So it's going from 1 to 100 typewriters, going from a typewriter to the first word processor. That's sort of vertical or intensive progress. And the basic argument is that those are the kinds of businesses we need to be building more of. If you succeed in building them, they can be very valuable because on the inside you often don't want to be copying things that work because you end up with super competitive businesses. You don't want to necessarily be starting the 20th pet food company, online pet food company, or the 1,000th restaurant in San Francisco, which is sort of my example of always a bad business to go into. So copying things that work is not always the best idea in business, but actually trying to do new things can often be both good for innovation and good for business. And you have to try to get that intersection just right.
Many of us have children who have decided they want to be entrepreneurs, and you see them by the raft. What's your observation about what young, smart people are doing? Are they headed down a right path, or do you find it disappointing?
Well, it's hard to generalize in such broad brushstrokes. I'm always a little bit nervous of people who say, I want to be an entrepreneur. So I think that's roughly in the same category of, I want to be rich, I want to be famous. You don't start a company or start a new business for the sake of starting a business. Ideally, you start a business because there's a very important problem that cannot be solved in an existing, large government, large corporate, large nonprofit structure. Why do you ever start new businesses? It's because large structures get too sclerotic, too political. They can't actually do new things, so it should always be anchored in some specific, substantive problem which you're going to solve. And I never liked the abstraction of starting a business for its own sake.
George Packer wrote a profile of you in The New Yorker. I think we can all agree that it was a disappointment to him that the magazine was The New Yorker. But we at The Atlantic take a broad view of this, and we think within another 100 years, they're going to really make something of themselves there. So George Packer said, here I'm quoting, he might be the most successful technology investor in the world. In 0 to 1, there's a 7-part test that Peter applies to investments that are brought to him. What I thought we might do is just go through a few parts of that test so you get a sense of the rigor he's bringing. The field that we're going to talk about for a moment is green technology, where Peter is a little bit of a contrarian in the community of people who are enthusiastic about it. So let's see how green technology fares against elements of the test. So one is the question of monopoly. Could you explain the test and what your thought on green technology is?
If you're starting a company, you always want to aim for monopoly, you want to have a large share of a market. And so paradoxically, it's often good if you start with small markets. If you go after small initial markets, and a lot of the like eBay started with Pez dispensers, and then it went to Beanie Babies. And then it gradually expanded into collectibles. And so that was sort of a very interesting way to start a business. And they often start with markets that are paradoxically too small. This has been true for so many of the great internet companies. The clean tech startups, they all started, the first slide of every presentation was, we have a market, it's called energy. It's measured in trillions of dollars. And we're like this tiny minnow in a vast ocean. And you never want to be that. So whenever you have vast markets, that's telling you the competition is going to be too intense, too undifferentiated. You're not going to be able to do something that's really interesting. And this was a very deep endemic problem to much of that field.
How does clean tech do against the test of durability?
You want to. A great company is not just the first mover. It's not just someone that does something new, but it's one that somehow will be a last mover, where it has some sort of a lasting advantage. There are many areas of clean tech innovation where it's been this sort of very small set of incremental improvements. So you come up with a new solar panel design, it's 10, 15% better than the next guy's, but then someone else comes along with a better design 1 or 2 years later, and you're out of business. So it's a good form of innovation for society, but it's paradoxically quite hard to get it to work on the business level. And there are many areas of innovation that have this sort of continuous feel to them, where it ends up being very difficult to get the business to work. Disk drive manufacturing in the 1980s, aviation, it was great for society, hard to get the business models to work. And so one of the tests I often have is, can we do something where you get enough of a breakthrough and then you somehow are able to maintain that lead? And that's often been quite hard to get that story told.
And then there's an elegant test of the secret. Will you explain that?
Well, it's just some answer to the question, what do you believe that other people don't? And so if a presentation if there are too many buzzwords in a presentation, that's always a worrisome sign. So in Silicon Valley, people are focused on educational software, healthcare IT software, probably overrated. SaaS enterprise software, very overrated. Big data, cloud computing, if you hear those words, you need to think fraud and run away as fast as you possibly can. And so if I gave you a startup that was a concatenation of buzzwords, we're building a mobile platform for SaaS businesses to bring big data to the cloud. My sort of pattern recognition is that the buzzwords, they're a tell, like in poker, that you're bluffing, and that there's nothing undifferentiated. There's no secret that you know that nobody else does. And I think that certainly during the clean tech bubble in Silicon Valley, which was about 2005 to 2008, you had again this sort of concatenation of all the buzzwords. They all sounded undifferentiated. You could work really hard and try to go beneath the surface and try to figure out, okay, was this one a little bit different from this other one in some way? But on some level, the surface of things was the heart of things. And if you just saw this litany of buzzwords, it was a good enough reason to be quite nervous.
Peter has an original view on the process of aging. He talks about people being too complacent about the inevitability of death. He talks about death as a problem to be solved. And he's done some funding, some nonprofit funding in this area. On the phone, I tried to push Peter to say, so how long can we live? And he resisted the question. Let's give it one more run. So pretend we're coming in at the top 20% of outcomes. 50 years from now, how long might the species live? In 200 years from now, how long might the species live?
Well, I'm still going to refuse to answer that question, and it's because I don't agree with this is not the right way to think about the future. The future is not this thing that is out there that's set in stone. This is like the Ray Kurzweil, the singularity is near. We have these exponential curves of progress. You know, there's a longevity trajectory where life expectancy has been going up by about 2.5 years a decade. It's been a straight line for 150 years, so you could extrapolate that. But I think it's never set in stone like that. And I think we should talk much more about, instead of the future, we should always talk about this question of human agency. What can we do to affect these problems and shape them? And I think on this question of aging generally, there are these deep forms of psychological denial or all these crazy psychological ways that we deal with it. And I think the combination that we have with aging is generally a combination of acceptance and denial. And acceptance is, we're all going to die. There's nothing we can do about it. Denial, it's not going to happen anytime soon, so I'm not going to think about it. And you can sort of think of acceptance as extreme pessimism, denial as extreme optimism, but they sort of always, extreme pessimism and extreme optimism always converge. Extreme pessimism tells you there's nothing you can do. Extreme optimism, there's nothing you need to do, and so it always sums up to doing nothing. And so I think that the question about the future should never be one of extreme optimism or pessimism, where it's just going to be this way. It should always be mild optimism, mild pessimism. It's contingent. There's a lot we could do one way or another. And so on this question, if we work at it, I think we could make tremendous progress. We could cure cancer. We could cure Alzheimer's. We might find there might be some general things that cause aging. So it may not be just these organ failures of one sort or another. I think there's a lot of general progress we could make. The question has barely been tackled, but it's something we have to choose to work on.
Peter, you did have a figure that if we defeat disease, then we die by the chance of accidents. What's the math look like there?
Well, if you solve the problem of aging altogether, that wouldn't necessarily make you immortal. You'd basically end up getting into a car crash or plane crash or something like that, and you'd die after about 600 to 1,000 years. And so then those things would become much more serious, and people probably would be very nervous about driving cars.
I want to close on a memorable note. So Peter meets Mark Zuckerberg. He's 20 years old. Zuckerberg is 20 years old at the time. Peter gives him, I don't know figuratively or how it's done, but you give him $500,000, and then you have 4 words of advice. Do you remember them?
Something like, don't mess it up. Want me to do it? It says something like, don't mess it up.
He's such a gentleman. So can we be agreed on this one point? What a marvelous job I've done raising this young man.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, don't move. We're not finished. We're not finished yet. Good afternoon. That will be yours. I'm Jeff Goldberg. I work for David Bradley. Thank you. That's for David Bradley. We decided, because it's been a long afternoon of conversation, that the best thing to do would be to end this session on a light and entertaining and humorous program. So we just want to talk about the future of the Middle East. And we have here to do that one of the world's reigning experts, certainly one of the leading American experts on the complexity of the Middle East, the challenges that the world's instability poses to U.S. national security. Of course, is David Petraeus. You have, thank you. Institute, but he is, I think it's fair to say, widely considered to be one of the most effective American generals, army leaders of the post-war era, and I mean World War II. I mean, if you look back and think about generals who've changed the course of American history and the American military, you have to put David Petraeus in the top category. So I want to jump right in with you, David, if we may. I was listening to this conversation about mild optimism and mild pessimism. We're about to approach what might be the most important moment in Obama administration foreign policy, the culmination of a long, hard slog toward an Iranian nuclear agreement. You have studied this for a long time, and you have just recently become very, very public in raising doubts about the particulars of the deal that seems to be taking shape at the moment. So I wanted you to talk about your criticism or your worries about where we might be headed to next week, and then we could jump from there.
Sure. Well, first of all, look, it's great to be back here, and it's wonderful to be with all of you that are hanging in there on a warm afternoon in the tent. It's wonderful to be interviewed by one of David Bradley's all-stars. You all know how he was recruited by David. If not, it makes a great story for later on. And then as to whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist, I'll give the same answer that I used to give during the surge in Iraq, and that is that I'm neither. I'm a realist. And the reality is that we are on the threshold of what could be potentially an agreement of far-reaching significance. And there's a group that I've worked with for over 2 years, includes a number of former Obama administration officials, political appointees, I guess I would count among them, and then others from other administrations. We do believe that we are nonpartisan or bipartisan, and we've been studying the Iran nuclear agreement as it's made its way along. And we recently published a letter, and it's signed only by those that are part of this group. Again, we weren't out looking for people to add, for tree trimmings or something like that. And it basically said that we're concerned about 5 aspects of the agreement, that to be a good agreement, which everyone has said, if it's not good, a bad agreement, no agreement is better than a bad agreement. Well, a bad agreement would be one that did not have sufficiently intrusive verification, that didn't provide an ability to determine the possible military dimensions of past Iranian activity, that did not have limits on advanced centrifuge research and development, that didn't have the proper timing of sanctions relief. As you know, the Iranians want the sanctions lifted immediately when they signed on the dotted line. There should at the very least be a phased sanctions relief where the really good stuff that they want is not actually, they're not released from that until you actually have met all of the major criteria that are in the agreement. And then provisions to resume sanctions. It's very important that if Iran is shown to have cheated, that there be an actual process that cannot be ended by the Chinese or the Russians casting a veto as a member of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council.
What are the consequences of a bad deal? Let's assume that the thing that you don't want to have happen happens.
Well, again, if you don't have sufficient verification, something untoward could go on. If you can't figure out what they did in the past in the military dimensions, again, you don't know, you don't have the knowledge that you really need to assure yourself that you can have this 1-year standard met, because the policy is to achieve a 1 year from the time that they decide until you could actually have a weapon. By the way, let me point out, there are many desirable features in this agreement. It takes all the 20%, gets rid of it, the 20% enriched uranium. It reduces the low enriched to a very small amount that can't be used for a single bomb. It retools the heavy water reactor that could have provided a plutonium path to a bomb. It rules out enrichment in the deeply buried site inside the mountain in Fordo. So again, there's a lot of goodness here. We should just recognize, again, be realistic, that if you don't get some of these other features, that you could have some surprises. And then the second is, remember, it ends in 10 years, some of it, and then some ends in 15. So we have to be careful not to assume, we have to think beyond that 10 years. I think to assume that Iran is going to change from its current power, it's a revolutionary power. It's not satisfied with the status quo. It wants to be the regional hegemon. And to go from that and support for various Shia militia proxy elements, designated terrorist groups like Lebanese Hezbollah, Shiite militias in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, and others in a variety of other places, all using their own terrorist designated organization, the Quds Force.
I want to come back to the deal in a second, but let me ask you this, because it's very clear on the part of the Obama administration. They believe that the money that the Iranians will get as part of this windfall, 100 billion, 150 billion maybe in the first year after sanctions relief kicks in, they're going to use that, the Obama administration argues, for roads and infrastructure, hospitals, schools, that they're not going to spend a lot of money on Hezbollah, on the Assad regime, on the Houthis in Yemen. Do you buy that?
Look, I'm sure that a great deal will be spent on those types of infrastructure projects. President Rouhani was elected to improve the lot and life of the people and to improve the economy. But when the times have been
is he really in charge?
When the times have really been tight, they've still managed to find the odd billions of dollars to fund Hamas, Lebanese Hezbollah, Shiite militias here and there, and other nefarious activities of the Quds Force and Hezbollah, not to mention just underwriting Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria on top of everything else. So the idea that this would not mean that more would actually go into that, I think, would be probably questionable.
On the deal itself, we talked about the consequences of a bad deal. What are the consequences of no deal? Put aside the idea that the supreme leader of Iran might just say no. Then it becomes fairly clear that we're moving toward confrontation. But what if, let's say, Congress steps in and does something, feels that the deal isn't good, undermines it in some way? Where are we then with a no deal situation?
Well, to some degree, it depends on how we get to a no deal. If it's a no deal because the countries involved all say this is just not a good deal and we shouldn't therefore go forward, that's very different. If it is Congress that says it, we could be in a difficult position with the Permanent Five members plus Germany who have negotiated this deal in good faith with us. So that Congress is in a difficult position in that case, and it'll be very interesting to see those dynamics. But if you really don't get a deal, then Iran presumably goes back to enriching more uranium. It replaces the 20% enriched uranium that it's already destroyed as part of the interim agreement, and it reverses those other steps where they walked back elements in part of the interim agreement, and it continues on the path, presumably, to more and more on the threshold of a nuclear weapon.
Would military confrontation be inevitable at that point?
I think it's inevitable if there is incontrovertible evidence that they are moving to make a bomb.
And is that
Or
military?
that's our president's policy. And that was very deliberately thought through, announced a number of different occasions, and I think it would be a mistake for Iran to think that's not
So
reality.
you believe that President Obama would still, under certain circumstances, use military force against Iran?
I think he would, actually. And I know, obviously, we've had red lines that turned out not to be red lines. There have been some other issues where decisions weren't made at key times. I think this is a different issue, and I clearly recognize how the administration has sought to show that this is very, very different from other sort of off-the-cuff remarks.
How did the administration keep Israel from attacking Iran? And do you think that if this deal does go south, that Israel would be back in the picture?
I don't, actually. I think Israel is very cognizant of its limitations. It knows that it cannot crack. This is publicly known. There's nothing I'm sharing. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs actually.
If you want to share
disclosed-
private information, please feel
Sure,
free.
I know. But Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in an open hearing did note that the Israelis do not have anything that can crack this deeply buried, hardened enrichment site inside the mountain at Fordo. And if you can't do that, you're not going to set the program back all that much. So is it truly worth it then? So that's a huge limitation. It's also publicly known that we have a 30,000-pound projectile that no one else has, no one else can even carry.
Explain that a little bit more.
Well, the massive ordnance penetrator was actually under design for probably, I guess now about 6 years. I think it was probably started when I was the commander of Central Command, when in fact it's publicly known that we developed the plan that if necessary, we can take out all these facilities and set them back for, roughly a few years based on your assumptions. But, that's another roll of the iron dice, as Bismarck used to say. And you never know when those dice are rolled what the outcome is going to be. You don't know what risks could materialize for those who are in harm's way. You don't know what the response could be by Iran. I mean, there's always an assumption there'll be salvos at Israel. But what if they decide to go at the Gulf states where we have facilities in every single one? This is not something to be undertaken lightly, clearly.
Let me broaden this out a little bit by mentioning two statements that were made the last couple of days here. I interviewed Ben Rhodes, who is the Deputy National Security Advisor.
Know him well.
As you do. And later that same day interviewed Lindsey Graham, asked them both the same question, which was, who is more dangerous to American national security? The Iranians, the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, or ISIS? The Shia extreme or the Sunni extreme? Ben Rhodes said without hesitation, ISIS. Lindsey Graham said without hesitation, the Iranians. Where do you fall on that?
Well, I used to do this for a living, and so mine is a little bit more nuanced. Interestingly, I think Ben is right on the threat to the United States. The ISIS threat really in the region, the Sunni extremist threat to our allies and partners in Europe and elsewhere in the world, and indeed to our own homeland. I mean, we've seen recent examples of what appear to be orchestrated attacks, and there certainly is a trepidation about this upcoming holiday that is a bit heightened over previous years. However, Senator Graham's right, one of the great members of the Three Amigos, as you remember, McCain, Graham, and Lieberman, about the only guys in all of Washington who had my back during certain times. But, Lindsey Graham's right that in the region, the Shia militia supported by the proxies, really, for Iran are very, very dangerous. And they really would, you sense, in fact, this possibility of an all-out Sunni-Shia civil war, because you have the Sunni extremists that would love to see that happen, and then you see the Shia militia, in some cases extremists, who are active in Sunni areas, for example, in Iraq, and that just doesn't work. It's one reason ISIS was able to get back into Iraq is because, of course, the government of Iraq alienated that Sunni Arab population that would work so hard to bring back into the fold of back into the fabric of society during the surge, and indeed for the years beyond that.
How dangerous is ISIS to the United States right now?
I think the danger to the United States right now is that they are seen as a successful organization, and nothing succeeds in the online recruiting business like success. Nothing succeeds in attracting would-be jihadists to a location. And just the sheer proselytizing that they can do on the internet, we've seen how they can get people who are almost trying to self-recruit. And it doesn't take many people with what you can buy at a gun show in America to cause enormous havoc if you open up in a mall or some public place that's full of people. So I think that's a significant danger. I don't think it's yet anywhere near the kind of 9/11 attack sophistication danger, but it poses, and then to our allies, and we've seen very vividly what has been done in Europe as a result of ISIS's recruiting.
If you were still advising the president, what would you advise him to do right now in Syria and Iraq, which is more or less the same battlefield? We hear reports, we've been hearing reports for years, of course, that Assad is on his last legs. It seems as if he's losing territory by the day, that it seems plausible, although it's almost impossible to imagine this, it seems plausible that some constellation of jihadist forces, including ISIS, could march on Damascus at some point. What does that mean for America, and what should the president be doing now, apart from what he is doing?
Well, in Syria, you've just flat got to accelerate the effort to get moderate Sunni opposition forces out there.
Is that possible, or is that just something that we say because there's no other answer?
I think it's possible. There certainly were moments when it was much more possible than it is now.
Was it a mistake not to do it in 2011?
You know, if I had advised something at that time, it would have been covert action, given where I was. And so not something that I can talk about now. New York Times certainly has some of the memoirs of the other participants.
So theoretically, if you had been running the CIA in 2011, you would theoretically have advocated for that?
Theoretically.
Theoretically. Okay. Just want to check.
Aggressively.
Aggressively and theoretically.
Actually, it's a little bit later, but.
Okay. Right. All right. But go
but I
on,
can neither confirm or deny.
Okay. He's not actually here at all, by the way. You're not even seeing that. It's a hologram.
But so you have to do that. I mean, again, we have to. Look, I don't care what your goal is in Syria at this point in time. You want to say let them break up. You want to say try to keep it together. You want to partition, whatever it is you want to do to defeat ISIL, which we have to do, and even the al-Qaeda affiliate, very likely, Jabhat al-Nusra, we've got to have a force that we can support to do that. We can use the Syrian Kurds for those areas in which they feel comfortable, but they don't want to push, nor should they push, into areas that are not traditionally Kurdish.
Are we in a position right now where it might become in the American national security interest to prop up the Assad regime?
No. I don't think an individual who's responsible for the deaths of approaching 250,000 Syrians, the displacement outside the country of millions, over 1 million each in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and many millions more inside the country, who really started this by violently putting down peaceful Sunni demonstrations, and who is supported by Hezbollah, the Quds Force, and Iran. So no, I don't think so. There's some attraction. I was invited to go see him several times, in fact, when I was a commander in Iraq. I know he wanted a photo op with a general, that kind of thing, and we're up for that on occasion. But I really wanted to go to him and say, Mr. President, you're allowing poisonous snakes, al-Qaeda facilitators, to have a nest in your backyard with the understanding that they only bite the neighbor's kids, Iraq. Sooner or later, they're going to turn around and bite you, and that's exactly what happened, because, of course, al-Qaeda in Iraq really regained its strength as the pressure came off them in Iraq, and then went over into Syria and really got themselves armed, equipped, funded, and everything else.
Here's an enormous question, which you can answer in 140 characters would be wonderful.
If you can ask it in 140 characters.
I can't clear my throat in 140 characters.
He's a journalist, David. Print journalist.
Print journalist. It's a terrible affliction. Why is the Middle East disintegrating? And the subsidiary question to that is, well, there's two subsidiary questions. One, what role did the Iraq invasion in 2003, if any, play in accelerating this disintegration that we see? And what role now can America play? One of the observations that I've made and others have made of President Obama over the past several years is that he has a tragic understanding of American limitations. Obviously, his critics believe that he has an over-understanding of America's limitations. But how did we get here? How did this disintegration come about? And are we really capable of turning this around as the United States?
Well, first of all, the entire region is not disintegrating. What you have are former countries that were ruled by autocrats, and almost all of them had 10 decent years, 10 middling years, and then 10 bad years. You look at Mubarak, for example. You look at the dictator in Tunisia, in Libya, in Syria. These were not the Gulf state monarchies, which, by the way, are doing quite well. Even two that have no real great oil wealth, Jordan and Bahrain, are hanging in there. And the others are bastions of stability. We may not like all of the political processes, human rights records, whatever. But, stability does have a bit to commend it when you look at the results of the Arab Spring in all countries, with the exception of Tunisia, and how tragic the event there, again, ISIL affiliated, it appears, that shoots up a bunch of dozens of tourists on a beach. What happened is, of course, you had situations that were actually, they seemed to be solid on the surface, but it was very fragile. And all it took was a spark, and all of a sudden you see a conflagration. And of course, it started in Tunisia, it spreads to Egypt, ultimately into Libya, Syria, and even Yemen. We retrieved Yemen for a while, but then it came unhinged again. The fact is that it's not clear that in all cases are all these countries going to be put back together again. There are various scenarios where the lines drawn, in the World War I period by the French and British diplomats, they may not endure. I think that's without question the case in some. In others, I do think they can endure. Interestingly, I actually think Iraq can stay together. It's going to take, the center of gravity, by the way, is in Baghdad, not on the front lines. Obviously, we've got to push those front lines back, kill, capture, displace the ISIS forces that are out there. And you can't allow these reversals, because they're strategically significant. They're setbacks. They're not just operational setbacks. But we've got to do all that we can to help the Prime Minister, who has espoused the right ideas. He wants again to get the Sunni Arabs back into the fold. He knows he needs to put limits on where the Shia militia can go over time. He's got to get them under national control. He's got to get a new deal with the Kurds, which is generally moving along reasonably well. But, one of the things that I hope we'll see in the weeks ahead or months ahead will be the establishment of a robust military headquarters actually in Baghdad at the 3-star level, with someone in charge of it who knew what we did back in the surge and the reconciliation component in particular, and can help the ambassador the way I tried to help Ambassador Crocker, and he tried to help me. And then, now obviously it's different if you don't have 165,000 troops and you're not the sheikh of the strongest tribe in Iraq, as I was privileged to be.
Right.
But you can have a huge impact, and we can.
Go to this 2003 question. Were we inadvertently the triggering mechanism that brought about everything that's happened since?
I'm not so sure that we were, actually. If you think about it, these didn't happen until, a good decade later. I can't for the life of me think of the link between Iraq, even the instability in Iraq, and why a fruit vendor self-immolates in Tunisia and sets off and cracks this seemingly solid crust, turns out to be so fragile that societal unrest takes off. And then you see it in Egypt as well. There's an interesting moment in Egypt that I continually reflect back on. President Mubarak would meet with me when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command. At a certain point, he'd lean and he'd put his hand on my knee. He was like a father figure. He was about 20 years older. And he'd say, General, don't ever forget the Arab street. Listen, he'd say, listen to the Arab street. And I'd like to go to him now and say, hey, Mr. President, what about that Arab Street, huh? What's that all about? But again, so I don't see that linkage.
Let's do one more thing before
Okay.
we close out, which is even bigger picture. We went through a period of, depending on where you come down on these issues, either hyperextension, overextension, appropriate extension through the Middle East, as many as 180,000 troops at different times in Afghanistan.
250,000.
250 total at one moment. Iraq. There's a feeling that this presidency, as a reaction to the previous presidency, is as much about underreaction as the previous presidency, the Bush presidency, was about overreaction. There's a lot of talk about dispensability now of the United States. We can't do everything. We shouldn't do everything. China is rising. We have to manage that in some way.
Yep.
The big question, you've studied this now over the past couple of years,
Yep.
traveling the world. The big question is, are we in a period of decline? Is that sort of decline the worst thing in the world for the United States? Talk us through.
Yeah.
Talk us through what's coming next.
Yeah, first of all, we are not in a period of decline, and I'll talk about that in a second. But second, I do think it is understandable. You know, my PhD dissertation was on the impact of Vietnam on thinking about the use of force. And, you know, when you go through, when you experience firsthand, in fact, these very visceral wars that we've been through, costly, frustrating, long in duration, setbacks and so forth, it's understandable, I think, that there is a bit of a reaction and the pendulum swings back in the other direction. I actually think it has now swung to where it is a more appropriate balance, perhaps should swing a bit further. Again,
ISIS bring it back?
I think ISIS did bring it back. Yep. I think the beheading of an American is a big deal. And the American public reacted to that, and so did their leadership. And now we recognize the threat that's posed. But I was in London a year ago, and somebody asked me in a conference, after the American century, what? And I think they expected me to say, after the American century, the Chinese century, the Asian century, or whatever. And I said, after the American century, the North American decades. Now, that's not a single decade. It's not a century. It's decades, and there's an S on the end. And the number of decades will be determined, as I'll explain in a moment. But we have this extraordinary opportunity because of the energy revolution, which has really completely upended, disrupted totally world energy markets. We're now the #1 natural gas producer in the world. We're the #1 oil liquids producer. It's larger than crude oil. We're the swing producer, no longer Saudi Arabia. And what this is doing for the economy, whether you love fossil fuels or not, you do have to do something to produce electricity. I'm all for moving to renewables and so forth, but in the interim, it is awfully
Aspen's
nice.
official position is we're ambivalent about fossil fuels.
Oh, okay, good.
Depends on if you own a plane or not.
I notice a big round of applause there. But I know that, you know, there's an insurmountable comparative advantage if you pay $2.75 for a million metric BTU of clean burning natural gas, and you're in Japan, which used to pay $17 for that same amount. Now it's down a bit because of crude oil, but this is extraordinary. Now that was enabled by, first of all, directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing. The last one is the cloud, as Peter would be familiar. It was big data, seismic technology that allows you to find that. That's the IT revolution, and that is what's making all the other revolutions possible. There's a manufacturing revolution that's beginning. Robotics, greater automation, additive manufacturing, three-dimensional printing. All of this is going to completely transform the workplaces we have known it in the past. And then that is further enabling the life sciences revolution. And all of these revolutions, you find Americans either completely leading or among the leaders. Beyond that, we have this enviable position. You know, Mexico is not asking China to pivot to Central America to offset, to balance against U.S. power, as every country that surrounds China and has a maritime beef with them is asking us to do. We have our #1 and 2 trading partners, thanks to the North American Free Trade Act and the high integration 20 years after NAFTA, makes Mexico our #1 trading partner, Canada #1 and Mexico #2. And each of those is poised on the threshold of further advances. Mexico, 16 reforms that President Peña put through in his first year. So we have this extraordinary opportunity. The problem is, with great respect to one of the earlier speakers, to Paul Ryan, that we have policy headwinds that have not been dealt with the way we need to by legislation and, of course, the White House working together with Congress. We've got to fix education. Has got to be reformed. We've got to do smart infrastructure investment. We've got to keep the debt to GDP ratio going down instead of starting to go up in a few years. There's a host of issues out there. Cybersecurity legislation, immigration reform, you name it, trade agreements, and thankfully we do have Trade Promotion Authority now, but that was much too close an affair. But we've got to get these headwinds turned around so that they're tailwinds, because China is slowing. China is not accelerating, and China is going to slow further, and I can lay out why that is. India may be on the threshold of the Modi moment, but there's not great momentum there yet. Abenomics has not yet truly transformed Japan, which faces a demographic death spiral anyway. So look around the world, and you tell me a country that is more advantageously positioned than our United States and North America's three countries.
To wrap up, is the question then not whether the U.S. is the indispensable nation? It's the question whether the U.S. wants to be the indispensable nation?
I think the question is how the U.S. can play what is an indispensable role as thoughtfully, intelligently, and cleverly as we possibly can.
General Petraeus, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our afternoon of conversation. Please join us for a picnic and a party outside the tent. Thank you so much.